How a single decision whispered in candlelight shaped centuries of sorrow. When we picture royalty, we often imagine crowns and robes, polished marble corridors, and portraits lined with gold. But the real inheritance passed down in Europe's palaces wasn't silver or titles. It was blood. Not just any blood, but blood carefully preserved, like wine that's been kept too long and turned bitter. In the beginning, the idea seemed noble. Keep the power close, keep the bloodline pure, ensure that the children who came next could rule not just by might, but by right, divine, undiluted, unchallenged. To do this, kings and queens didn't just marry royalty, they married their cousins, and then their nieces, and in time, their uncles. Not out of affection, but of arithmetic. It wasn't about love, it was about math. A daughter who married a foreign prince might one day give birth to a rival, but a daughter who married her cousin, her children would keep the family's claims intact. No castles lost, no borders blurred, and so the royal houses of Europe began to turn inward. The Habsburgs, the Trastamaras, the Capetians, they didn't invent inbreeding, but they perfected it. At first, no one noticed. A little shared ancestry here, a repeated name there. One generation of cousins didn't raise alarms, but two became three, and three became a tradition. Family trees began to fold in on themselves, not branching outward like forests, but curling like ivy strangling a wall. It's tempting to think they didn't know. That maybe medieval monarchs didn't understand biology, but they understood consequences. They saw the miscarriages, the stillbirths, the children born with twisted limbs or jaws so pronounced they couldn't chew. They watched sons die young and daughters fade before their wedding night. And still they didn't stop, because the cost of breaking the bloodline felt greater than the price of another quiet funeral. The church technically forbade such unions. Marriages between close kin were seen as sinful, a disruption of God's natural order. But for royalty, rules bent easily. A papal dispensation, a signed permission slip from the Pope himself, could make an uncle's wedding to his niece perfectly acceptable, as long as it secured a peace treaty, as long as it ensured no outsiders inherited the throne. These weren't decisions made in war rooms. They were whispered over maps by candlelight, signed in ink and sealed with wax. And it wasn't the kings who bore the weight of these choices. It was the women, the daughters of empires, the vessels of dynastic dreams. They were married off at 13, sometimes younger, packed into carriages with lace and dowries, sent across mountains to meet cousins they barely knew. They smiled in portraits, stood quietly during ceremonies, and were expected to produce heirs as quickly as possible. Sometimes they did, sometimes they couldn't. And when they couldn't, the fault was rarely seen as fate. It was seen as failure. Her fault, her womb, her punishment. Behind palace walls, there are stories of queens who buried more children than they named, of princesses who bled for months after difficult births, of young brides who wrote letters home describing headaches that never stopped, fevers that came without cause, and dreams that turned dark too soon. In some cases, the damage was visible: jaws too long, spines too curved, bodies too fragile to walk. In others, it was hidden: minds that frayed, moods that shifted, depression dressed as piety, rage mistaken for madness. And yet these women weren't weak. They were survivors, diplomats, regents, scholars. They ruled while their husbands drank. They governed while their sons waged war. And all the while they carried within them the quiet burden of a bloodline too tightly wound. Not all royal daughters suffered visibly. Some lived long lives. Some ruled brilliantly. But even in their strength, the echo of those choices lingered. The cost of keeping power pure wasn't always a tragedy you could see. Sometimes it was just a silence that followed them through the halls, a weight they carried with no name. Tonight we begin with them, not the kings who signed the treaties, not the princes who inherited the thrones, but the women who gave birth to history and bore the bruises in silence. The first drop of royal blood wasn't spilled in war. It was passed down gently, generation after generation, until the silence grew loud enough to echo. She wasn't born to rule, only to continue the ruling. She was born into a palace, but the only room that mattered was the one inside her body. Long before she had her first monthly blood, long before her body had matured enough to carry another life, there were already expectations, silent, soft, shaped like prayers but heavy like iron. In the eyes of her family, she was never simply a daughter. She was the promise of continuity. She was a womb wrapped in lace, a kingdom waiting to open. Royal women were not raised to be loved. They were raised to be useful. Their bodies were measured not by their minds or their voices, but by their fertility. A flat stomach wasn't a symbol of beauty. It was a sign of failure. A swelling belly meant success, meant purpose, meant a future secured by blood. Not her own blood, but the blood she would grow for the dynasty. Her value lay in her ability to give birth, and then to do it again, and again, until a son arrived. And even then, she was expected to keep going, in case the first one didn't live. They called it duty. They said it with pride, with reverence, as though it were an honor to be chosen to carry the next sovereign in your body. But they never called it what it really was: a quiet war. One fought inside the walls of the body, inside cells and veins and bones, pushed beyond repair. A war with no armor, no sword, no banners, just pain that came in waves and silence that followed. There were no parades for women who bled to death in childbirth. There were only hastily written eulogies, and then another girl brought in to take her place. Behind the beauty of portraits and the elegance of titles was a reality few spoke of. Labor that lasted for days, screaming muffled by thick stone walls, blood that soaked through feather mattresses and never came out, midwives who crossed themselves as they waited for the final breath. A royal birth was a public matter, attended by courtiers and doctors and advisors, all waiting just outside the chamber. But a royal death in childbirth was private, shadowed, tucked away behind veils and quiet whispers, buried in chapels where her name was carved beneath her husband's and her son's. Sometimes the child lived, sometimes neither of them did. There are letters, some still kept in archives, written by queens who begged for rest, women who had carried 5, 6, 7 pregnancies in as many years. Women who miscarried so often that they lost track of how many lives they had carried briefly, only to lose before they could be named. Women who had no time to grieve because another attempt had already been scheduled, another cycle being watched, another month of waiting for the sign that the body had succeeded again. It was not called abuse. It was called responsibility. It was called sacrifice, and it was expected. Even when the babies came whole and breathing, the mother rarely got to keep them. Wet nurses fed them, tutors raised them, advisors trained them. The queen's job was done the moment the child took its first breath. Her next job was already waiting. Another child, another heir, another use for the same body barely healed. And if the child was a girl, the process would begin again. Another womb for another alliance, another body for another cause. The cycle was not broken, it was refined, strengthened, justified by tradition, by religion, by the myth that this was the noble woman's fate. But in quiet moments, perhaps alone in her chamber, with only candlelight and time, some of these women may have questioned it, may have touched their scars and wondered what it meant to be chosen again and again, only for pain. May have prayed not for peace in their lands, but peace in their bodies. Not for a son, but for a moment where their worth wasn't measured in blood. History remembers queens for the sons they bore, the alliances they secured, the crowns they carried into their cradles. But their bodies remember something else. They remember the nights without sleep, the cramping that never stopped, the stretch marks hidden beneath silk, The trembling hands that signed baptism records for babies who would not see winter. Their wombs were kingdoms, but kingdoms can break. And tonight we pause to remember them, not just as mothers of kings, but as women whose bodies were written into history without their permission. Women who were crowned in the chapel and buried in the same dress they wore to give birth. Women who were not failed queens but exhausted ones, not broken vessels, but unwilling battlefields. They gave everything and were remembered for almost nothing. Not a girl, not a bride, not a queen. Just a signature on a treaty she never read. Long before a crown touched her head, long before she saw the face of the man they told her to love, long before she was old enough to name her fears, the decision had already been made. She would marry for the good of the realm. And by the time her feet could barely reach the floor beneath her throne, the treaties were already drafted, the dowry already weighed, the lands already promised. Because in royal courts, a daughter was rarely a child. She was a currency, a diplomatic letter sealed in silk and lace, passed between kingdoms in exchange for peace, for trade, for borders that would not bleed. No one asked if she wanted it. No one ever did. That was not her role. Her duty was to smile, to curtsy, and to carry the future in her womb. And in return, she might be painted in oils or remembered in prayer, if she was lucky. Across Europe, throughout centuries, young girls born into royal bloodlines were betrothed before they could read, promised to men decades older, often relatives, rarely strangers, but never lovers. Their names appeared in marriage contracts as though they were property, inherited, exchanged, bargained. And in a way they were, because to the men around them, the kings, the bishops, the uncles, the fathers, they were vessels through which the dynasty would survive. Love was irrelevant, preference meaningless. Their future was a map already drawn, and their consent not even a footnote. Some were sent abroad, riding for days in uncomfortable carriages, seasick on merchant ships, waving goodbye to mothers they would never see again. They arrived in foreign lands where the language was strange, the food unfamiliar, and the rules silently enforced. Everything about them was scrutinized. Their hips, their lineage, their ability to conceive. They were examined like livestock, adorned like altars, and expected to perform as queens on arrival. And many did, gracefully. Out of fear, out of training, or simply out of no other choice, a few tried to resist, quietly, through pauses, through tears, through faint refusals. But it changed nothing. The marriage always happened. The gown was always laced. The priest always spoke the final words. Because to refuse a royal wedding was to threaten war, and no girl, no matter how frightened or unready, was allowed to be the cause of bloodshed. Better to bleed in childbirth than on the battlefield. At least that way, the kingdom remained intact. In court records, the terms are cold. The Infanta was wed to the Dauphin. The Archduchess was granted to the Duke. The Queen Consort was presented. But behind those lines were girls who loved music, who wept when pets died, who whispered secrets to their handmaidens, who wondered what snow looked like in another country. Girls who wanted to paint or read or remain with their sisters. And instead they were packaged in brocade and gold thread and shipped like relics, like bargaining chips, to places where their names were mispronounced and their bodies politicized. And yet history remembers so few of them. We know the names of kings who sent them, the wars they were meant to prevent, the treaties their marriages secured. But their voices, their letters, their dreams, those faded beneath the weight of dynastic duty. In some cases, they bore sons and were praised. In others, they failed to do so and were cast aside, quietly confined to distant castles with only whispers for company. A few died young, their bodies too small or too fragile for the task they were forced into, and the kingdom moved on. To be a princess was to be born into a prison lined with silk, to be admired from afar but never asked what lay beneath the crown, to be the image of grace while your heart bent beneath invisible chains. These women were not given choices, they were given roles. And for every happy union that history celebrates, there were a dozen others built on silence, sorrow, and sacrifice. Some were mourned, most were forgotten. But tonight, in this quiet space, let us remember them, not for the men they married or the lands they helped unite, but for the girl who sat alone the night before her wedding, clutching a letter from home, knowing she could not turn back, and whispering to herself in a language no one around her understood. Not a queen yet, not a wife yet, not a woman yet, just a bargaining chip wrapped in velvet, bound for a future she never chose. They said it was God's will, but it was always man's plan. In the cathedrals where light poured through stained glass like liquid fire, where incense curled around the marble altars, and where holy men whispered Latin prayers above golden books, another kind of silence was born. Not the silence of reverence, but of consent. A silence that nodded when kings asked for exceptions. A silence that allowed blood to fold in on itself, generation after generation. It was the silence of the church. And for centuries, it wrapped itself around Europe's royal families like a velvet cloak, soft and heavy, lined with approval. The church was never naive. It knew the rules. Scripture forbade marriages between close kin. Leviticus spoke clearly and canon law echoed it. Cousins, uncles, nieces. These were unions declared unclean, unnatural, even sinful. In theory, the lines were drawn, but in practice, they were bent. And when the crown asked, the church answered, not with judgment, but with parchment, not with refusal, but with permission. It was called a dispensation, a single sheet of paper signed and sealed by a pope, declaring that what was once forbidden was now permitted, because politics demanded it, because peace required it, because kingdoms needed it. And so the church, guardian of morality, became the architect of exceptions. Over time, those exceptions became the rule. The Habsburgs married their nieces, the Capetians married their cousins, and no bishop spoke against it from the pulpit. Perhaps they believed it was better to marry a cousin than wage a war. Perhaps they feared what might happen if the crown turned against the cross. Or perhaps, like everyone else, they understood the game and chose to play along. After all, the church had much to gain from royal favor. Land, protection, influence. A queen's womb and a papal seal could secure more than just a bloodline. They could secure power. And so the prayers were said, the vows exchanged. The incense swung gently in time with the choir. A girl, barely 14, might kneel beside a man twice her age and call him husband. The priest would bless them both. He would not mention that they shared a grandmother. He would not speak of the miscarriages to come or the child who would be born with a jaw too long to close. He would simply anoint their heads with holy water and call it divine. There are records of popes who granted dozens of dispensations during their reigns. One even signed off on a marriage between double first cousins, children of siblings who had themselves married siblings. The genetic web tightened, and still the church smiled. In Spain and Austria, in France, the pattern repeated. Not out of ignorance, not out of malice, but out of strategy. The same strategy that built cathedrals and crowned saints. The women at the center of these unions had no say. Their marriages were arranged before they could understand the word forbidden. The man standing at the altar beside them might have been their cousin, their uncle, or both. And when the priest placed their hands together, it was not an act of love. It was a transaction, sanctified. In some cases, the consequences were immediate. Infants who could not breathe, mothers who could not survive the birth, children born with limbs twisted, minds fogged, bodies that did not work. In others, the damage unfolded slowly. An heir who struggled to walk, a princess who wept for no reason, a prince who forgot how to speak. These were not curses, they were not punishments, they were biology. But the church did not speak of biology. It spoke of God's will, of divine purpose, of trials sent to strengthen the soul. And so the pattern continued, generation after generation, blessing after blessing, bloodline after bloodline, until the royal families of Europe were less family trees and more family circles. A dynasty was not a line, it was a loop. Some historians have argued that the church believed it was doing the right thing, that in a world where kingdoms rose and fell with every wedding, it was better to allow these unions than to risk civil war. Others believe it was simply politics in priestly robes, a way to stay close to power, no matter the cost. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps none of it matters to the girl kneeling at the altar, her hand trembling in her cousin's grasp, the future already inside her and the blessing already given. Tonight, as we sit in our quiet rooms, far from thrones and incense, we can see clearly what they refuse to. That purity of blood is a myth, that holiness cannot be assigned by paperwork, that a womb is not made sacred by the approval of men in red robes. It was never divine law that demanded these marriages. It was human ambition, and human ambition will always find a way to justify itself, even in the language of heaven. What happens when the branches no longer grow outward, but wrap around themselves instead? In gardens across Europe, royal palaces were known for their trees, manicured hedges, carefully trained vines, rows of roses that never touched the soil without permission. But the most carefully cultivated plant of all wasn't found outside in the courtyards. It was hidden in books, bound in leather, written in Latin, and guarded like scripture. The family tree. It began simply, as all trees do, a trunk, two branches, a king and a queen. Their children spread outward. Their children's children filled the margins, names curled in ink, titles in bold, territories sketched beside them like petals. But with time, the names began to repeat. The same blood reappeared, the same faces, the same marriages, only closer now. Cousins marrying cousins, then nieces, then uncles. The lines no longer stretched across borders. They looped. And so the tree changed, no longer reaching toward the sky, no longer growing outward with vigor. It began to bend, to circle, to spiral, until it no longer looked like a tree at all, more like a wreath, a crown, beautiful from a distance, but tight, closed, suffocating. The word inbreeding rarely appears in royal correspondence. They preferred kinder terms: consolidation, legitimacy, purity. But the reality was clear. Generation after generation, the pool grew shallower. The branches folded back toward the trunk, and the results were not merely theoretical. There were children born with jaws so long they could not chew, heads misshapen, eyes too close, limbs too short, minds that wandered or never formed at all. Some lived long enough to be painted. Others never made it past the cradle. And still the marriages continued, because the logic was sound, at least on parchment. If you marry your cousin, you don't lose any castles. If you marry a stranger, you risk everything. Better a broken child than a broken claim. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Habsburgs, a dynasty that ruled across Spain, Austria, the Low Countries. Their family tree is a study in repetition, names repeated with mathematical precision. Marriages carefully arranged, not to branch out, but to pull inward. They called it strategy. The world would come to call it pathology. One emperor was the product of more than 20 lines of inbreeding. His family tree did not branch. It circled like a noose. His face was unmistakable. The Habsburg jaw, long and heavy, hung from portraits like a warning written in bone. He could not close his mouth. He could not eat without help. He could not walk alone. And yet they crowned him anyway, because the blood was pure, because the name was right. There is something both haunting and deeply human about the need to keep a name alive at all costs. The belief that a family must remain untouched, unbroken, unsullied by outside blood. That to mix is to weaken, that to open the door is to let in the storm. But history does not lie. The more tightly the family held to its own blood, the more fragile that blood became. Doctors of the time didn't understand genetics, but they saw the symptoms, the fragility, the madness, the high mortality. They offered prayers, leeches, and herbs, but no cure, because the illness was never in the body. It was in the blueprint. Royal women bore the weight of this loop most cruelly. They were the ones who bled in birth, who mourned the babies that did not cry, who watched sons with strong names crumble under the weight of brittle bones. And yet they were expected to try again, to marry another cousin, to trust another prayer, to believe that this time perhaps the child would be whole. In portraits, you can trace the decline. A princess in the early 1400s with soft features, her granddaughter with a narrower chin, her great-grandson with the unmistakable slope of the Habsburg profile, and the boy after him who never spoke, never ruled, and died without understanding the legacy he had been born into. It is tempting to blame ambition, to say they should have known better, but ambition is rarely honest, and fear is even worse. To marry outside the family was to invite foreign claims, to risk rebellion, to trust someone new. The known, however flawed, always felt safer. And so the branches curled and curled until there was nowhere left to grow. Tonight, we remember the names that repeated too often. The daughters who married men with their father's eyes, the sons who carried both glory and ruin in their veins, and the family trees that became circles, not by accident, but by design. Not out of love, but out of fear. Because in the end, the crown they tried so hard to preserve wasn't just passed down, it was passed inward. The same eyes, the same jaw, the same silence. Copied across generations like a signature too often forged. In the long galleries of European palaces, portraits hang in rows like whispers preserved in oil. Faces all regal, all composed, all still. Each painted to project power, stability, divine right. And yet, if you stand quietly in front of them, just long enough, you begin to notice something else. A sameness. Not in the way painters flattered their subjects, but in the bone beneath, the length of the nose, the downward pull of the lips, the unnatural width of the jaw. A face not born anew in each generation, but repeated, carried forward, preserved like a relic, inherited like a debt. It was most visible in the Habsburg dynasty, but not only there. Across the courts of Europe, royal faces began to echo each other. A daughter who looked like her mother, a prince with his aunt's teeth, a king whose face mirrored that of his cousins, and his uncles, and his wife's. The royal portrait became less a celebration of the individual and more a reminder of a bloodline too close to breathe. And the longer the loop continued, the sharper the resemblance grew. One face again and again, painted as strength, but framed in fragility. These weren't accidents of heredity. They were the results of choices repeated over centuries. Choices to marry kin, to double down on the same blood, to preserve a name, even if it meant losing everything else. And the evidence wasn't just in portraits, it was in bone. Modern science would come to name it prognathism, mandibular deformities, cranial asymmetry, mental decline. But at the time, there were no such words, only euphemisms. He has a difficult jaw. She is delicate of mind. Their line is touched by God. But the truth was written in oil, in the set of the eyes, the length of the skull, the way the mouth never quite closed. In some portraits, you can see a child trying to smile but failing, not because he didn't want to, but because his jaw could not allow it. In others, the eyes are vacant, as if the spirit never fully arrived. The tragedy deepened in the children, born not with a name, but with a face already known. Before they could speak, they were already expected to resemble someone who ruled, someone who married a cousin, someone who died before 20, and they did. They match those expectations with chilling precision. What must it have felt like to look in a mirror and see the same features worn by your grandfather, your mother, your cousin wife? What did it mean to know that your face was not yours, but a repetition of past decisions? That your jaw carried the weight of treaties signed long before your birth? That the tilt of your eyes was not merely chance, but design? Artists tried to hide it sometimes. They softened the features, added color to the cheeks, turned the face slightly away. But the resemblance always returned, like a ghost, uninvited, unchanging. There is something both beautiful and haunting about these portraits, because beneath the gold leaf and velvet robes, they are stories of people trapped in flesh shaped by fear. People whose bodies told the truth long before the chroniclers dared to. People who could not help but look like their past. And for the women, the repetition was not only visible, it was demanded. A queen was praised if she gave birth to a boy who resembled his father. More so if he resembled his grandfather. Most of all, if he resembled the founder of the line. A healthy baby girl who did not look royal was quietly pitied. A boy with the wrong face might be hidden from view. The family resemblance was not only preferred, it was proof. But proof of what? That the line remained pure? That the blood had not strayed? That despite the whispers and miscarriages, the dynasty still held? Or was it proof of something else? A warning, perhaps, that too much sameness is not stability. It is collapse in slow motion. A family folding inward, not only in name, but in flesh. A crown passed from hand to hand, carried on shoulders grown more fragile with each generation. A jaw that grew longer, a mind that grew dimmer, a silence that stretched between the brushstrokes. Tonight we look at the portraits not as art, but as echoes. Not as vanity, but as testimony. Each face repeated, a chapter in a book too reluctant to turn the page. A face that could never smile fully, a face that could never look away. They crowned him anyway. There was a time when the word heir inspired hope, a future secured, a name continued, a crown prepared. And yet, in the royal courts of Europe, that hope began to bend beneath the weight of what it had become. The heir was no longer the strongest son or the wisest. He was simply the only one left, the one born into the right name, the right bed, the right blood, however fragile, however flawed. And so, when the time came, they crowned him anyway. Some could not speak, others could not walk. Some understood nothing of the ceremonies unfolding around them. Others understood too little, too late. They were children with the minds of toddlers, men with the minds of children, bodies shaped by generations of narrowed blood, minds that had not been given the space to grow. And still the crown descended. Because to not crown him would be to admit the failure, to admit that the line had broken, to admit that purity had not preserved strength, but drained it. And so they dressed him in gold. They wrote his speeches, they placed counselors at his side, sometimes behind him, sometimes in front of him, holding his hand. In public, he waved. In private, he wept, or stared, or simply sat unmoving, unaware. There is a cruelty to tradition that pretends all is well, that arranges the coronation as though the boy upon the throne were born for greatness, when in truth he cannot even button his own shirt, that prince coins with his profile when his jaw cannot close and his eyes drift toward the ceiling, that parades him before the people as a symbol of continuity, when everyone, quietly, tenderly, knows that the real continuity is the suffering. Historians have found documents, letters from nobles, diaries of court physicians, whispers captured on paper, of kings who could not remember the names of their advisors, of heirs who choked on their food each day, of regents who ruled in their name for decades, pretending that the sovereign was simply shy or spiritual or deeply contemplative. The truth, of course, was harder to speak. He was not ready, he would never be ready, but he was all they had. And so the machinery of monarchy rolled forward. A body placed on a throne, a name declared in churches, a reign that began and ended without ever truly belonging to the one who bore it. The system required a king, and it did not care whether he could think or feel or dream. What then of the others? The brothers who were stronger but born second. The cousins denied because their blood was not quite right. The mothers who watched silently as their sons were led like lambs into palaces too large for their minds to comprehend. And what of the sons themselves? Those who could feel something was wrong, but lacked the words to say it. In some cases, the heir lived in isolation, a wing of the palace, quiet and sealed. He was visited rarely, shown only in paintings, described as serene or reclusive or scholarly. In truth, he may have sat each day with toys he never outgrew, or wandered hallways forgetting who he was, or curled in bed, afraid of the world outside. But the public heard none of this. The throne was occupied, the crown intact. That was all that mattered. Until, of course, it wasn't. Until war came, or succession was challenged, or the king died young and childless, and the line cracked open like a rotting tree. Only then did the cost of silence become clear. Only then did they ask what had gone wrong. But by then, it had gone wrong for so long that no one remembered what right ever looked like. And through it all, the portraits remained. A boy in robes too heavy, a man with eyes too distant, a king in name only, crowned not for what he was, but for what they needed him to be. Tonight we remember not the power he held, because he held none, not the laws he passed, because others passed them for him, but the child who became king before he became a person, the boy whose only mistake was being born first, the heir who was not ready. The error no one could admit, soft silk, cold walls, and eyes that watched more than they loved. At first glance, it seemed like a dream. The royal nursery with its carved wooden cradle, its golden embroidery, its ceiling painted with cherubs and stars. Soft light filtered through heavy velvet curtains. Dolls sat neatly on shelves no child ever chose. A fire burned in the hearth, more for ceremony than warmth. Everything in its place, everything perfect. But beneath the lace and lullabies, it was never really a room for children. It was a room for expectations. From the moment a royal child was born, the world around them shifted. They were not held by their mother for long, perhaps only once, if at all. They were passed to wet nurses, to governesses, to servants whose names history never wrote down. Their cradles were watched not by family but by guards. Their sleep was timed, their cries recorded, their weight measured, their appearance scrutinized, their future whispered about in adjacent chambers by men with titles and maps. Because the nursery was not a sanctuary, it was a stage. The child was not a child. They were a seedling of state, a living gamble. If they were strong, they would be groomed. If they were weak, they would be hidden. If they were both, strong in appearance, weak in mind, they would be polished like glass and placed on a high shelf, carefully posed, never touched. Some royal infants were adored, but even that adoration came with strings. Love in the royal court was not unconditional. A prince who cried too much was called temperamental. A princess who wandered too far was deemed wild. A child who played too loudly could be shushed not with a frown, but with exile to another room, another wing, another estate altogether. It was never called punishment, it was called preparation, and so the nursery became a quiet place. Too quiet, a place where laughter felt out of place, where joy was tolerated only if it appeared dignified. Toys were chosen for symbolism. Education began before language. Tutors arrived before teeth. And always, the expectations grew faster than the child could. What they ate, how they walked, when they slept, who they could speak to, none of it belonged to them. Their world was designed by others. Their milestones were recorded not with pride, but with urgency. Could he sit up yet? Could she bow without falling? Could he memorize the names of his forefathers before his 6th birthday? The answer had to be yes, because anything less was failure. And failure in a royal child was treason in miniature. But not all children met those marks. Some were born too soon, others too frail. Some had fits. Some stared blankly for hours. Some screamed and could not be soothed. And for these children, the nursery grew colder still. Curtains closed, visitors limited. Names erased quietly from future plans. They might be listed as delicate in court documents, of a gentle disposition, or simply not mentioned at all. And what of the mothers, the queens who birthed them, who longed to hold them, but were told that it was better not to get too attached, that the child was in good hands, that the affairs of state could not wait for lullabies. Many of these women never saw their children outside of formal audiences. They watched from behind veils as others raised their sons. They sent notes. They prayed. Some rebelled, softly, slipping into the nursery unannounced, writing lullabies into the margins of letters. But rebellion rarely changed the order. Because the nursery was not a family room, it was a training ground, a showcase, a rehearsal for the burden of monarchy, and those who couldn't bear it were replaced, if possible, or tolerated if necessary, or grieved when the silence finally became permanent. The paintings of royal children rarely show toys. They show scepters, tiny crowns, scrolls. They do not show scraped knees or missing teeth. They show polished shoes and practiced expressions. But behind each of those portraits was a child who once cried for a mother who could not come, who once hid under a table just to feel alone, who once whispered to a doll in the dark because no one else listened, and then grew up, if they were lucky, never quite knowing what safety meant. Tonight we remember the nursery not for its splendor, but for its silence, for the echo of small footsteps heard only by servants, for the soft breathing of children who were not allowed to be children, for the little hands that reached for comfort and found only protocol, tiny hands never held long enough to be missed out loud. In the long corridors of royal palaces, some doors never opened again. Behind them were cradles that had already been taken away, rooms where nurses whispered rather than sang, and candles burned not in celebration, but in mourning. Because not every royal child lived. Not every birth was followed by a christening. Some were followed by silence, by fast footsteps, by servants carrying linen stained in a color they would never speak of. Infant mortality was common in every class, but in royal families it carried an added weight. Not just grief, but consequence. A dead baby wasn't only a lost child, it was a broken alliance, a threat to the succession, a sign that the bloodline might not hold. And while ordinary women might mourn openly, a queen was expected to compose herself, to recover quickly, to try again. Some of these children were named, others were not. Some lived for days, some for hours, some never breathed at all, but each one had a place, brief as it was, in the royal archive. A line in a journal, a mention in a priest's record, a date carved too early beneath a stained glass window, and then nothing. For those born of tightly woven blood, the chances were even worse. When cousin married cousin, the risks multiplied. Some babies were born with fused skulls, others with twisted limbs. Some could not feed, others simply faded. And in the great halls hung with tapestries and triumphs, their absences were not spoken of. They were too many, too small, too politically inconvenient. But in the hearts of the women who bore them, they remained. There are letters buried deep in archives, written by queens to their sisters, their confessors, their gods. Letters that spoke not of court life, not of treaties, but of empty arms and silent nights. Of feeling milk rise for a child already gone. Of being congratulated one day and forgotten the next. Of having to dress in mourning clothes while the midwives cleaned the blood from the nursery walls. The church offered explanations. Perhaps the child was too pure for this world. Perhaps it was divine will. Perhaps it was the price of Eve's sin. But the women knew better. They saw the swelling, the convulsions, the breath that never steadied. They saw their own blood pass down too tightly, too often until it could not hold. And yet they tried again and again, because to stop was to fail. To rest was to risk the throne. Their bodies became vessels for hope so fragile that even naming it felt dangerous. In some cases, they waited days before allowing a priest to baptize, just in case the child died, just in case they had to bury without a name again. When a royal child did survive, celebration filled the palace. Bells rang, feasts were held. But somewhere, just beyond the reach of those joyful sounds, a mother remembered the others, the ones buried quietly, the ones who had no portraits, no statues, no titles, only a soft cloth tucked in a drawer, a name whispered once, then never again. And for the ones who lived but did not thrive, those who lingered for weeks or months before slipping away, there was another kind of mourning, slow, drawn out, the kind where hope claws at reality and reality wins. Their deaths were met with gentle phrases. He returned to heaven. She was too delicate for this world, but the truth was simpler. The bloodline broke them before the world had a chance to. Some nurseries were painted over, some cradles burned, some queens asked never to see the room again. Others, quietly, returned to sit in the corner alone. The sound of silence is different when it's where a child should have cried. And the kings, some grieved, some did not. Some returned to court duties the same day. Some arranged for the next attempt before the first grief had cooled. Because the dynasty could not wait. Because a dead child, however mourned, did not change the demands of history. Tonight we speak their names. Not because history did, but because someone should. The unnamed sons, the daughters who died before baptism, the tiny heirs who never wore a crown, but bore the weight of it all the same. They lived briefly, and then they didn't. But in the quiet spaces of royal life, the pages left blank, the halls kept shut, the lullabies unsung, they remain. They measured her worth in acres and armies, not in lullabies. She had barely lost her first tooth when the letter arrived. Folded in thick parchment, pressed with the seal of 2 kingdoms, the words inside spoke of alliance, of future peace, of honor to be shared. But nowhere did it speak of her, not the way she spoke of herself. Quietly, while holding a wooden doll missing an arm, or whispering to the puppy that followed her through the garden. In that letter, she was not a child. She was an asset, a dowry, a promise inked before she ever learned to write her name. They told her gently, or tried to. A governess mentioned the great destiny ahead. A priest said God had chosen her path. Her mother cried only once, in a room no one else entered. Her father did not cry at all. He kissed her hair, told her she would be brave, and signed the papers the same day. She did not understand what marriage meant, only that her dresses would change, her name would change, her bed, her language, her meals. She would leave the room with the window that faced the apple orchard. She would leave the old nurse who knew her nightmares. She would leave her brothers who had begun to forget to wave. Some left at 12, some at 10, some at 6. Some were promised at birth and shipped away before memory could take root. Sent to foreign courts to be raised not as daughters, but as investments. Groomed to please men they had never met. Taught to recite the customs of a country they would one day call home, though it never would be. In portraits they looked serene, perfectly brushed hair, slight smiles. But behind the paint, there were girls who missed their toys, who asked when they could visit home, who cried for mothers too far away to hear. Girls who were told to stand still, to smile, to behave, because they were being watched, because their behavior reflected not on them, but on the power of the house that sent them. At court they were judged for everything: how they walked, how they sat, how they responded to praise or silence. A word out of place could mean insult, a moment of play mistaken for immaturity. And so they practiced stillness, learned to mask confusion with courtesy, to nod when they didn't understand, to curtsy even when their knees ached, to smile when the man beside them was twice their age and already called them wife. Not all of them were unhappy. Some grew into the roles they were given. Some found comfort, even love. But all of them were chosen, not for who they were, but for who they came from. Their value was blood, not soul, a connection between two crowns, a ribbon stretched between distant cities. And when the marriage began, the world celebrated. Bells rang in countries they would never see again. Feasts were held, poems written, and in the quiet of her new chamber, the girl-turned-wife stared at the bed, the mirror, the stranger who now called her his. No one asked if she was ready. No one asked if she wanted this, because that was never part of the plan. The contract had been signed long ago, when she still had milk teeth, when she still spoke with lisped excitement about horses and cherries and snow. There are letters, tiny, careful, childlike, written by these girls, some tucked between Bible pages, some hidden in locked drawers. Notes to mothers, to dolls left behind, to the nurses who once sang to them in another tongue. They asked simple questions. Do you still think of me? Can I come home? Am I doing well? But the answers never came. Or if they did, they were written in the language of state, warm but distant, polished but hollow, because the girl was gone. In her place stood a woman the world expected to rule, to produce heirs, to forge alliances. Even if she was still only 13, tonight we remember her not as a queen or a duchess, not as a footnote in treaties or a name on a lineage. We remember her as a child, a girl who played once in palace gardens, who laughed before she learned to be quiet, who was sold not in cruelty, but in tradition, a tradition that said this was her purpose, that she was a bargain, and that a good bargain never speaks. They shared grandparents, but not choices. She had known him her entire life. At family banquets, they sat 3 chairs apart. At coronations, he had been the boy in the velvet coat who wouldn't stop fidgeting. At holidays, they exchanged polite gifts, carved boxes, miniature portraits, a pressed flower sealed in glass. They were cousins after all, not strangers, not close, just familiar. Familiar enough for her to never imagine anything more. And yet, years later, he became her husband. The announcement came not with joy, but with silence. Her governess did not smile. Her mother looked away. Her father spoke only of duty and how fortunate it was that the bloodline would remain unbroken. No one asked if she wanted to marry her cousin. No one asked if she wanted to marry at all, because that had already been decided before her first dance, before her first kiss, long before her first dream of something different. They said it was tradition, that royal blood must not wander, that the purity of lineage was sacred, that they shared not only ancestry, but destiny, that this was how kingdoms stayed strong. They did not speak of the risks, of the stillbirths, the deformities, the fading minds. They spoke only of names, of lines in the family tree that must circle, not stray. And so she married him. The wedding was beautiful. Gilded arches, velvet altar cloths, trumpets echoing in the cathedral stone bones. She walked slowly, each step rehearsed, each breath measured. And when she reached him, she saw in his eyes the same uncertainty she carried. He was no villain, just another piece on the board. A boy told he was now a man. A cousin told he was now a husband. Their wedding night was quiet, awkward, gentle, confused. He kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes and pretended to sleep. Neither of them spoke of love. They had no language for it, only the script they'd been handed. And they followed it, word by word, year by year. In time, children came, or didn't. Some were healthy, others were not. Some lived, others didn't. And with each birth, the midwives whispered more softly. The doctors wrote more cautiously, because the risks were no longer theoretical. They were real and growing. But still the practice continued. Cousins married cousins, over and over. First cousins, double cousins, uncles to nieces, aunts to nephews, royal blood circling like a closed loop. They said it kept the crown strong, but it did not keep the children whole. She grew older. Her features, once soft, became tired. Not from years alone, but from expectations, from funerals too quiet, from portraits she posed for beside children she feared might not see the next season. And beside him, her husband, who still shared her face in too many ways. They rarely argued. There was nothing to argue about. Their lives were aligned but not intertwined. They shared a home, a crown, a lineage, but not dreams, not truly. They had both been born into a plan written long before them, and they had followed it as best they could, out of duty, out of fear, out of the quiet hope that maybe this time things would turn out differently. History has not been kind to these unions, nor has it fully condemned them. They are footnotes in textbooks, curiosities in documentaries. But behind each record lies a real woman who looked into the face of her husband and saw her uncle's eyes, who gave birth to children who carried too much of one face, who wondered, in moments too private to speak aloud, what might have happened if the world had allowed her to choose. Tonight, we remember her not with judgment, but with understanding. She did not make the rules. She lived them. She wore a crown fashioned from her own family tree. And when she looked across the table at her cousin-turned-husband, she did not see romance. She saw inevitability. Because in the courts of Europe, love was a luxury, but blood was a currency, and she had been spent before she ever knew the cost. Not all crowns are made of gold. Some are made of silence, expectation, and the ache of being watched. She was born to a world where nothing she did would ever be quite enough, yet everything she was would always be judged. From the first moment the midwife announced, "It's a girl," the room had grown a little quieter. Not disappointed, not openly, but dimmed, as if the future had lost some of its weight. A son would inherit, a daughter would be given. That was the order. That was the rule. And so from the beginning, she belonged not to herself, but to possibility. She was dressed in silks that scratch, taught to smile without showing too many teeth, taught to walk without sound, sit without slouching, speak without questioning. She learned the names of flowers, the lineage of kings, and the art of looking agreeable even when her stomach hurt or her shoes pinched. While the sons learned to ride, to hunt, to lead, she learned how to disappear in plain sight. Graceful, pleasing, perfect. Every gesture was watched, every glance interpreted. If she looked too long at a boy, she was warned. If she spoke too plainly, she was corrected. Her body was not her own. It belonged to the court's gaze, to suitors she had never met, to portraits painted before her figure had even matured. She grew into her womanhood like stepping into a costume stitched too tightly, sewn with threads of decorum, virtue, and fertility, because that was her greatest value. Not her thoughts, not her kindness, not her dreams, but her womb. Her ability to carry a name forward, to bind two nations, to produce sons who might one day wear crowns of their own. She was praised for her beauty, but never asked if she liked her reflection. She was adored for her gentleness, but never given space to rage or to cry too loudly. Her silence was interpreted as grace, her obedience as wisdom, but none of it was seen for what it truly was: survival. When marriage came, and it always did whether she asked or not, it came as a transaction. Her dowry measured in land and coin, her future husband's title compared to her father's with strategic precision. She might be sent across seas, she might never return, And even if she did, she would no longer be her father's daughter, but another man's wife, another country's queen, another court's property. She smiled through wedding processions, bowed to foreign mothers-in-law, and was expected to produce an heir as soon as the bed curtains closed. And if the child didn't come or didn't survive, the whispers would begin. Was she barren, cursed, disobedient, displeasing to God? Rarely did they blame the husband. Even more rarely did they look beyond the union to see the bloodlines collapsing on themselves. Some princesses bore it well. Some broke quietly. Some disappeared into illness, or silence, or sainthood. Others rebelled in small, almost invisible ways. A letter burned, a book hidden beneath the mattress, a glance held a moment too long with someone she should not have seen, but most simply carried on, because that was what was expected. And expectations were heavier than any jeweled diadem. She wore the crown not just on her head, but in the way she walked, the way she smiled, the way she bore the weight of her family's hopes in the cradle of her own ribs. Her spine straightened by duty, her dreams folded into the hems of her gowns. And when history remembered her, it remembered her beauty, her wedding, her children, not the cost. Not the girl who once wanted to dance barefoot in the grass, or sing too loudly, or love someone with no title at all. Not the woman who learned to suppress the shake in her hands when her husband raised his voice. Not the queen who gave birth 6 times and buried 4 of them in silence. Tonight we do not praise her composure. We remember her exhaustion, not the crown she wore, but the weight she carried. The daughter who was always told she mattered, but only in the right shape, the right tone, the right womb. The woman who learned that to be perfect was to be invisible, and that sometimes the heaviest burden is to be admired without ever being known. She smiled in the painting, but in life her hands trembled even when no one was watching. They called it melancholy, sometimes nerves, sometimes spells, sometimes divine punishment, but never madness, not out loud, not in court, not in the presence of a crown. Because to admit that a royal daughter had fractured, that her mind had wandered too far from the path carved for her, was to admit that something within the bloodline had come undone. And so they painted her calm. They posed her with roses, with prayer books, with folded hands and downcast eyes. They froze her in stillness while her real self screamed beneath brocade and lace. She had not always been this way. There had been a time when she laughed at the way wind tossed her veil or chased her brother through a corridor without thinking of posture or grace. But over time, the corridors grew longer, the windows fewer, and the laughter quieter. Sometimes gone entirely. They told her to sit still, to be proper, to be silent. And so she learned to silence more than her voice. She silenced her thoughts, her anger, her confusion, until the silence inside her grew louder than anything outside. They said she had visions, that she heard things others did not, that she feared mirrors or shadows or her own reflection, that she wept for hours then smiled as if nothing had happened, that she sang lullabies to chairs and named each crack in the wall as if they were friends. And yet no one stopped the ceremonies. No one paused the paintings. She still posed, still bowed, still married when told. Because to be a princess was to perform. Even when the performance was cracking at the seams, doctors came sometimes. They bled her, gave her tinctures, prayed over her, said it was the womb, or the moon, or perhaps her nature, but never the life she had been forced to live. Never the pressure, the isolation, the relentless expectation. Never the way her days blurred into a haze of embroidery, obligation, and unspoken grief. Some were locked away, not cruelly, at least not in name. They were sent to country estates for rest, to convents for reflection, rooms with soft walls and heavy locks, where the walls bore witness to whispered prayers and the scraping of fingernails along stone. Some survived, some didn't. Some faded so gently that no one noticed until they stopped speaking entirely. And still in the public eye, they were delicate, pious, private. Others were paraded still, their minds fraying at the edges while the court clung to the illusion. A queen who laughed at nothing during banquets. A duchess who insisted her long-dead dog still slept at the foot of her bed. A girl who refused to wear shoes, believing the marble floors would burn her. And through it all, the advisors smiled, the painters flattered, the people speculated, but no one dared say the word madness, because madness in a royal woman was dangerous, not only for herself, but for the perception of the crown. It meant the blood was flawed, that the line had cracked somewhere unseen, that perhaps marrying cousin to cousin, generation after generation, did not preserve strength, but weakened it. And so they hid her illness beneath layers of silk, covered her absences with rumors of retreats, of illness, of modesty. They wrote her out of speeches, out of portraits, out of history itself. But sometimes she slipped through. A diary hidden in a drawer, a letter filled with scribbled thoughts and looping lines, desperate and raw. A servant's note describing screams in the night. A priest's confession about the pale figure who wandered the chapel barefoot, eyes unfocused, mouth murmuring forgotten prayers. Fragments scattered across archives that together formed the outline of a girl who was not mad by nature, but made mad by circumstance. And still they painted her. Always the portrait remained. Smooth skin, serene eyes, no trace of the hands that shook, the lips that trembled, the mind that had slowly, silently unraveled. A portrait of composure, framed in gold, hung in silence, admired for centuries. Tonight we do not admire the image. We remember the woman behind it, the girl who broke, not because she was weak, but because she was human in a world that did not allow it. The daughter whose mind was sacrificed for the sake of appearances. And the silence that followed her into history, quiet, gilded, and unspoken. What was meant to grow into a forest became a wreath, circular, beautiful, and strangling. They were meant to be the branches of empire, stretching outward, spanning nations, binding lands not with war, but with blood. That was the promise of royal marriage. One daughter to this throne, one son to that. A wedding here, a treaty there. And in the beginning, the tree did grow, its roots deep, its limbs wide. But over time, as trust grew thin and the world grew more dangerous, the branches began to fold inward. Marrying outside became risky. What if the foreign bride brought treachery? What if the foreign prince sought more than alliance? And so, bit by bit, marriage became not a bridge to new families, but a loop within the same one. Cousins wed cousins, then cousins once removed, then uncles to nieces, again and again. Until the family tree no longer looked like a tree at all, but a crown of thorns, intertwined, circular, bleeding from within. On paper it made sense. Keep the blood pure, preserve the divine right, avoid entanglements with lesser houses. But in practice, the consequences crept in slowly, first as whispers, then as patterns, then as fate. Babies born with too large skulls, children who could not speak, boys who died before their first winter, girls who bled too long, too early, too often, and still the pattern continued. They did not have the words we use now: genetic disorder, recessive trait, chromosomal collapse. But they had eyes. They saw the similarities. The jaw too square, the eyes too close, the limp that returned generation after generation. They saw the sons who never learned to rule, the daughters who never left their rooms. They saw the decay inside the gold. But what choice did they have? To marry outside was to weaken the claim. To invite another name into the bloodline was to invite doubt. And so they chose strength, illusionary though it was. Strength that could not bear weight. strength that shone on banners but crumbled in the nursery. Some kings buried their dead without names. Others insisted on continuing the line, even when it was clear the line no longer held. A few dared to break the cycle, married into fresh blood, brought in distant noble houses, but those were rare, often punished by court disapproval or divine suspicion. Because change in royal circles was feared more than fragility, the result was a genealogy that read more like a riddle than a lineage. Pages filled with the same names repeated like a chant. Charles, Maria, Philip, Isabella, on and on, looping back upon themselves until one could trace a child's parents to a single shared grandfather, or worse, to a mother who was also an aunt. It was not family, it was echo. Historians today chart the maps. They build webs of connection and marvel at the intricacy. But for those who lived inside it, it was not intricate. It was inescapable. A girl might know from the cradle who she would marry, might look at her cousin across the hall and feel not affection, but resignation. Because the future was already written, and it read like the past. Even the portraits show it. The same noses, the same pale brows, the same tired gaze repeated across generations like a haunting. The faces did not change. They narrowed, thinned, grew sharp and ghostly, until by the end, it was no longer a family but a reflection, peering back at itself with vacant eyes. Tonight we do not marvel at the tree's symmetry. We mourn its collapse. We trace its branches not in admiration, but in sorrow, for all the children who carried too much of the same blood, for all the mothers who gave birth knowing what might come, for all the lives spent circling a legacy that grew smaller with every generation. They did not fail. They were failed by tradition, by fear, by the illusion of strength within a gilded cage of sameness. And in that silence, the family tree twisted once more, seeking light but finding only its own shadow. They praised her beauty while she lived, and even more once she no longer breathed. She had always been lovely. That was the first thing people said about her, even before they learned her name. Her hair shone like burnished gold. Her cheeks were touched with rose, her hands delicate as porcelain. Her beauty was a comfort to others, a reassurance that all was in order, that the kingdom was graced with a daughter worth painting, worth presenting, worth marrying. She learned to smile for the artist, to hold her breath while the brush traced her image, to stand still as eyes lingered longer than they should have. They said she was graceful, that she moved like a flower turning to the sun, but they never mentioned how tightly her corsets were laced, how she fainted after long ceremonies, how her feet bled beneath brocade shoes not made for walking. They praised her figure without asking what it cost to maintain. They compared her to angels, goddesses, saints, each one more silent than the last. When she walked into a room, men stood straighter, women whispered, eyes followed, but no one asked her what she thought, what she feared, what she wanted, because beauty was enough. It excused her silence. It excused their ignorance. It was the currency she never chose but was expected to spend, again and again. And then she died, perhaps in childbirth, perhaps of fever, perhaps from years of slow decay the doctors could not name. Her body simply stopped trying. She was 20 or 30 or 17. It hardly mattered. The moment she died, she became legend, and her beauty became eternal. The coffin was carved in white marble. Angels knelt at its corners. Her image, young, unmarked, and at peace, was etched into its surface, as though death had only perfected her. Crowds gathered not to mourn, but to witness, to see the silk draped across her lifeless form, to marvel at how she still looked so serene, so untouched, so beautiful. Poems were written, songs composed. Her name became a whisper of loss and longing. She was too good for this world, they said, too pure, too lovely. As if that explained everything, as if that excused the years of pressure, of isolation, of being nothing more than something nice to look at. Her death became a spectacle, a confirmation that beauty and tragedy must always walk hand in hand, that the fair must die young, that the lovely are never meant to last. And so they framed her final image in gold, hung her portrait where guests could admire the soft curve of her neck, the gentle light in her eyes, never knowing that by the end, she could barely breathe. They buried her beneath flowers, lined her path with candles, said prayers that made no mention of the pain. They did not speak of the miscarriages, the bleeding, the silence. They did not speak of the night she tried to run, or the mornings she did not rise from bed. They spoke only of her grace. Her name was preserved in stone, her face on medallions. Her death became a cautionary tale of fleeting beauty, of the fragility of women, but never a story of what broke her, never a question of whether she was meant to be broken all along. Because in the end, her worth was measured not by her words, but by the shape of her coffin, how smooth the wood, how fine the lining, how peaceful the expression they painted onto her still face. She was beautiful, they all agreed, and so they mourned what she had represented, not who she had been. Tonight we remember her not as an image, but as a person, a girl who tried to breathe beneath the weight of praise, a woman who was admired until it killed her, and a queen whose coffin was as beautiful as her smile, because no one had ever let her be anything else. They lit candles at every birth, but kept the mourning cloth close at hand. From the outside, the nurseries of royal palaces seemed like sanctuaries. Warm light flickering from carved sconces, soft sheets of finest linen, lullabies sung in voices trained to be gentle, cradles carved from oak and inlaid with pearls, mobiles that spun not with painted toys but with golden stars and tiny angels. Yet within those velvet-lined walls lay a fear that no luxury could quiet, that the child in the cradle would not live long enough to wear a crown, or even speak a name. The first cries were always met with celebration. A son born to a queen, a future king. Trumpets might sound, bells might ring, and foreign courts would be informed by courier before the mother's fever had broken. But inside the nursery, behind the closed doors, the air was heavy with a silence that no fanfare could dispel. The physicians looked too closely. The midwives exchanged glances. The wet nurse checked again and again for breath. Because they all knew this child might not see his first winter. The bloodlines had grown thin, too much repetition, too few new roots. The cousins who had married and then produced sons now watched those sons grow frail and pale and distant. Some had jaws so misaligned they could not suckle. Some had spines that curved where they should not. Some never cried at all. Others cried too much, as if their tiny bodies already knew something was wrong and could only wail in confusion. And still, more children were born. The royal family could not stop. Heirs were not a luxury. They were a necessity, a duty, a political tool. Each child a symbol of continuity, of power, of stability. Even when the child was weak, even when the child could barely hold up their own head at 3 years old, even when the child never spoke, never walked, never understood why the hallways grew quieter each year, as siblings disappeared into marble tombs before they ever learned to read, their mothers wept behind curtains, sometimes beside the crib, sometimes in chapels, sometimes nowhere at all, because grief was expected to be silent when wrapped in ermine. A queen who lost her child was told to try again. A duchess was pitied, then pressed to produce another, and another, and another, until her body gave out, or her mind did, or she herself joined the marble rows of women who had done their duty and died. The surviving children were cherished, but cautiously. They were dressed in lace so fine it barely touched the skin, fed from silver spoons, kept from drafts, from crowds, from noise. Any cough brought a priest and a doctor. Any fever was met with prayers and poultices and trembling hands. Because everyone knew a child of royal blood could die as swiftly as they were born, sometimes without cause, sometimes despite everything. And when they did die, it was always called something else. A sudden illness, a tragic accident, a visitation from God. Never a consequence, never a price, never the result of a system that kept circling the same blood through the same bones until the very breath of life came out thin and broken. In paintings, the royal families looked whole. Children arranged neatly in size and rank, smiling faces, hands resting calmly on toy horses or globes or flowers. But if you look closely, you would see the empty spaces, the odd gaps, the child who was there in one portrait and not in the next, the name that disappears from records after a single winter, the soft, lingering ache in the queen's eyes that never quite leaves, even as she poses again, expecting once more. Tonight we remember not the triumph of lineage, but the sorrow of repetition. The children who were born into cradles of gold, but could not carry the weight of names already too heavy. The mothers who whispered songs into ears that would never hear. The nurses who wrapped cold limbs and were told to stay quiet. They were born into palaces, but not for this world. Because some lineages did not pass on strength, they passed on silence. And in that silence, too many royal children faded before they could ever speak a word. The crown did not rest on her head, it rested in her womb. And it took and took and took. No one spoke of the rooms where there was no cry, where the linen stayed too white, where the midwives glanced at one another and then down at the floor, and the mother already knew, long before they told her, that the child would never be held in her arms. They called them misfortunes, accidents, God's will. But they happened too often and to too many women whose only crime was obedience. A royal womb was not a sacred space. It was a battlefield. And stillbirth was its silence after war. She was praised when she conceived, draped in prayers and well wishes. Toasts were raised in foreign courts before the first month had passed. Portraits were sketched with her hand resting gently on her belly, already framing her as the giver of future kings. But few stayed to watch what came next. The slow pain, the sudden emptiness, the hours between the final contraction and the final silence. Some happened early, a child never formed, a life too fragile to begin. Others came late, cruelly so, a body fully shaped, fingers curled, eyes closed, a weight in her arms that should have stirred but didn't. The cries of the mother louder than the child's ever were. And then the quiet rituals began. The chamber was cleared, the priest arrived. The infant, too small, too still, was wrapped in cloth finer than anything peasants wore in life. Sometimes baptized, sometimes not. Buried beneath cold stone marked only with a cross and a name that would never be spoken again. The queen was expected to rest, to recover, to try again, because the kingdom needed heirs, needed insurance, needed proof of divine favor, and if one child did not survive, then another must come, and another, no matter the risk, no matter the toll. Her grief was her own. Her duty was public. Few dared to mourn with her. Fewer still allowed her to speak of it. The pain was folded beneath courtly smiles, beneath ceremonies resumed too quickly, beneath the tightened bodices that hid the softness of a womb that had held death. And she carried on, as royal women always did, with silence, with grace, with a weariness that no crown could hide. Some queens lost one child, others lost 5. A few gave birth 10 times and buried half of them, and yet their portraits never changed. Always serene, always composed, as if the centuries of loss had left no mark. But the record books tell the truth. Gaps in succession, infants named and gone in the same year, mothers buried with titles but not all their children, and behind every name lost is a woman who once sang softly to a growing life that never answered. The throne did not mourn, it demanded her body again and again, and she gave it, not because she wanted to, but because that was what queens were made to do. They did not rule, they produced rulers. And when the ruler-to-be died before drawing breath, the queen did not become less. She simply became expected. Expected to smile, to heal, to offer herself again to a bed she feared, to hope again, knowing hope could end in cold swaddling, to sit through christenings of other women's sons with empty hands folded tightly in her lap. And still they called her fortunate, privileged, chosen. But tonight, we remember her not for the crown she wore, but for the cradles that stayed empty, for the lullabies she sang alone, for the aching silence of a room prepared for a life that never arrived. These were not accidents. They were the foundation stones of dynasties, quietly stacked, unnamed, and forgotten, except by the women who bore them. The throne stands still, but beneath it lies a graveyard no one visits. It was dressed in lace and satin, but it was never soft. It bore witness not to passion, but to power. The royal wedding was a spectacle. Music in the chapel, rose petals on the stairs, guests dressed in their finest silks. The bride, barely more than a girl, walked with practiced grace, her hands trembling beneath gloves no one would let her remove. The crowd saw her smile. They saw the jewels in her hair, the promise in her posture. They did not see the ache in her chest, the dread that pulsed louder than the church bells. Because the true ceremony began later, after the toasts, after the dances, after the courtiers had gone to their rooms and the laughter had grown thin. Behind closed doors, the new queen, or princess or duchess, was led to a chamber that had been prepared not for comfort, but for confirmation. The sheets would be white, witnesses would be nearby, and what would happen next was not a choice, but a ritual. They called it duty, they called it custom, but it was neither tender nor fair. It was expected. She had been raised to believe it was her purpose, that this night, above all others, was the reason she had been born, to lie still, to receive, to ensure that the lineage would continue. Her education had spoken of it in hushed tones, through metaphors and embroidery patterns. No one had told her about pain, about fear, about how quickly love could become an instrument of pressure. And so she lay beneath canopies of gold, while a man, often older, sometimes a stranger, sometimes as frightened as she was, took what tradition said was his right. Sometimes he was kind, often he was not. Sometimes he drank too much, sometimes he didn't speak at all. Sometimes he left without a word, and she was left alone, bleeding quietly into silk. If the sheets were stained, they were shown. Proof of virtue, proof of consummation. If not, rumors began. Questions arose. Was she frigid? Was she pure? Had she resisted? Was she barren already? Few asked if the husband had faltered. Fewer still asked if the bride had wept. Because the royal bed was not a place for love. It was a place for results. It was where alliances were sealed in flesh, where treaties were carved into wombs, where a girl's body became a nation's hope, and her pain became irrelevant next to the needs of succession. Some grew used to it, others never did. A few found moments of comfort in time. Many more learned to disassociate, to stare at the canopy, to count the folds in the drapes, to recite prayers in their head until it was over. They were praised for their composure, for being good wives, for enduring. And when pregnancy came, they were celebrated again. Not for joy, but for utility. And when it didn't, they were prodded, examined, blamed. Their bodies no longer their own, but open books for midwives and ministers and monarchs alike. The royal bed was wide, but she slept on the edge. Her hands curled inward, her breath shallow. She was never alone, yet never truly touched. She was surrounded by attendants, but no one asked how she felt, because queens did not need comfort. They needed to produce. And the bed, once meant to be a place of rest, became a place where dreams were replaced by expectations, and skin grew thin under the weight of silence. Tonight we remember her not as a bride, not as a vessel, not as a symbol, but as a woman who lay beneath a crown, beneath a man, beneath the pressure of a world that mistook endurance for consent. She did not go to battle, but she carried the bruises just the same. They named him with trumpets. They buried him in silence. The bells rang when he was born. A son, a healthy cry, they said. Strong lungs, a future king. The wet nurse smiled. The midwife wept. The courtiers clapped with relief, thinly veiled as joy. At last, the crown had its heir. At last, the queen had done what she was meant to do. There was wine in the halls, blessings from the clergy, letters sent to distant relatives. And in the nursery, he was swaddled in silk, laid gently in a cradle carved from ancient cedar, guarded by maids who whispered, "He looks just like his father." But by nightfall, something changed. The room was too quiet. The baby's breath was uneven. His skin lost its warmth, then its color. Panic bloomed like frost on glass. The nurse called for the physician. The queen sat upright in her bed, still weak from labor, her arms aching to hold what had already slipped beyond her reach. By dawn, the kingdom still had its bells, but they did not ring. It happened more often than history likes to remember. Children born into palaces who never left the nursery. Princes announced with fanfare and buried before their christening robes could be embroidered. Tiny hands that never curled around a finger, eyes that never learned to focus, bodies that failed without explanation. And each time the walls of the palace absorbed the sorrow like old stone absorbs rain, slowly, deeply, without protest. Some blamed the air, some blamed the stars. Some whispered that the blood had grown too thin, too twisted, but the queen was never allowed to ask why. Not out loud. Her tears were acknowledged, then set aside. Her grief was given a timetable, 3 days, 5 at most. And then she was expected to rise, to dress, to thank God for the child's brief life, and to prepare her body for the next. The child was given a name, and then a tomb. Sometimes both within the same day. The portrait painters arrived too late. The cradle remained untouched. The garments hung on the wall as reminders of a future that vanished like breath on glass. The nurses were changed out. The bedding burned. The queen sent away for rest, as if rest could ever be found in the echo of silence, where a cry should have been. There were ceremonies, but smaller ones. No fanfare, no parades. Just a short service at dawn, a coffin no bigger than a basket, lowered into marble crypts beside siblings who had never met. The courtiers bowed their heads. The king clenched his jaw. The world moved on. But the queen didn't. Not truly, not ever. Some kept lockets of hair. Some named their next child the same name, as if trying to reclaim what had been lost. Some spoke of the dead only in whispers. Others never spoke of them again, but all remembered, in the quiet moments, in the empty rooms, in the way their hands sometimes drifted to their bellies as if something might still be there. History does not tell their stories. The records list the births, then the deaths, then the next birth, as if grief could be washed away by the next conception. But between those lines lives a sorrow that shaped queens more than crowns ever did. Tonight we light a candle not for the princes who lived to reign, but for the ones who never left their mother's arms, for the heirs in the morning, the corpses by dusk, for the futures that flickered and faded before they could speak a word. They were loved, they were wanted, and they were gone. They knew the truth but kept their hands folded, not out of fear, but out of duty. She entered the palace through the servants' corridor. Not through marble halls, not through the grand staircase, but through the back, the way all necessary women entered. She carried with her more than linens and herbs. She carried generations of knowledge passed from mother to daughter, woman to woman, not written in books, but in hands that knew how to feel life before it began, and how to sense when it was slipping away. The midwife was not noble. She did not wear rings or brocade. But queens held her hand when the pain grew too great, and kings left the room when she raised her voice. She was both invisible and indispensable, and in the end, the only witness to truths the crown could not afford to remember. She arrived when the queen's labor began, sometimes in daylight, more often in the quiet hours before dawn. She knew the signs, knew how to coax the child downward with oil and prayer, knew which herbs would ease the pain and which ones would quiet it entirely. She could hear what others could not, the change in breathing, the hesitation between heartbeats, the way the silence stretched too long between contractions. And when it came time, she was there, not for glory, not for thanks, but because someone had to be. Sometimes the birth was easy. A child slipped into the world wet and screaming, lungs strong, eyes bright, and she smiled just a little before wrapping the child in cloth finer than anything her own children had known. But often, the birth was not easy. The child did not cry, or cried, but too weakly, or came too soon, or came too late. And in those moments, she did not cry out. She did not panic. She only worked faster, quieter, because she understood that her voice was not meant to disturb the silence of the crown. She knew how many children the queen had lost, knew which ones had lived only long enough to be named, knew which chambers had been swept clean too quickly, and she kept it all inside, because midwives were not historians. They were shadows, and shadows do not speak. Sometimes she was asked to lie, to say the child had been stillborn, though it had gasped once, to say the child had cried, though it never had, to say the queen was resting, though her sheets were soaked in blood, and she nodded, and she complied, not because she lacked conscience, but because she knew the walls had ears, and the ears did not like the sound of truth. She buried children with her hands. She prayed over them. Sometimes she was the only one who did. She whispered their names to no one, just so they would be spoken aloud once, and then she returned to the shadows. Some midwives served their queens for decades. They saw 3 generations born and buried. They recognized the curve of a royal jawline and knew what it meant. They watched bloodlines falter, watched girls too young be told to open their bodies for dynasties, watched the cost of glory be measured not in crowns, but in tiny fingers that never curled. And still, they served. History does not name them. The records call them an attendant, a woman of the chamber, a midwife, unknown. But they were there, every time, in every room where a queen screamed, in every hallway where a cradle was carried out empty, in every whispered conversation between maids who knew what could not be said aloud. Tonight we remember them, the quiet ones, the necessary ones, the ones who kept the secrets of the palace in their hands and never let them fall. They did not wear crowns, but they bore the weight of everyone that was placed upon another's head. She looked in the mirror and saw not herself, but her mother, then her aunt, then the one no one talked about. The mirrors in the palace were old, silver-backed, framed in curling brass, smudged at the corners by time and servants' claws. They were not made to flatter. They reflected with honesty, unforgiving, patient, still. And when the girl stood before one, dressed in a gown chosen for her, hair brushed until it shone, she did not see the softness of youth. She saw something colder, something older, something frighteningly familiar. She turned her head slightly, and the woman in the mirror turned too. Not as a child might, but as someone who had turned in that same way long ago. Her jawline was sharper than she remembered, her eyes too dark, her mouth curled in a way she couldn't place, until she remembered the portrait in the West Quarter, the one of her aunt, or her grandmother, or the queen who had died without heirs. She had been told she looked like them, always with pride. You have your great-grandmother's chin. That's your mother's smile. Those are royal cheekbones. But it no longer felt like inheritance. It felt like repetition, as if she were not becoming someone new, but becoming someone again. and she didn't know how to stop. At dinner, the king sometimes called her by the wrong name, a sister's name, a mother's. At court, old ladies curtsied and whispered that she reminded them of a cousin long buried. The ladies in waiting exchanged glances when she grew silent, the way her aunt had before the illness began. And when she laughed too loudly, someone muttered, "Just like her mother, before things changed." It was not flattery, it was foreshadowing. She began to study the paintings more closely, to walk the galleries alone, to trace the embroidered initials on dresses long boxed away. She found a diary once, half burned, tucked behind a cabinet. The handwriting looked like her own. The words were fragmented, lonely, afraid. She didn't finish reading it. At night, her dreams were full of rooms she had never entered. But that felt familiar. A locked tower, a child's cry, a mirror that wouldn't stop reflecting, and always a face staring back that looked like hers, but older, worn, cracked around the eyes, as if it had looked too long at something no one should see. The physician said she was tired, that she should rest, that these thoughts were not fitting for a princess. She tried. She drank the herbal teas. She walked in gardens. She prayed, but still the reflection waited. Not just in the glass, but in the way she spoke, in the way her hands moved, in the way she could predict with frightening precision how people would react, because it had all happened before, and she was only the next verse in a song no one dared stop singing. The palace had a memory, and it was etched into bone. Sometimes she wondered if they saw her as a person or as a revival, a second chance to get it right, a mirror that might not crack this time. But it did not matter. The lineage was what mattered. The face, the blood, the echo, not her. And so she stood before the mirror each morning, tied her hair the way the portrait showed, smiled the way her grandmother had been painted, folded her hands as her aunt had been buried, and she tried not to look too closely, because the longer she looked, the less she saw herself. Tonight we remember not the women whose names filled the royal genealogies, but the ones who lived twice, once as themselves, and once again in the eyes of a girl who never got to be her own, but no one ever said whose blood it began in, only whose mind it ended in. There were rooms in the palace that were always locked, heavy wooden doors carved with patterns long faded, kept closed not out of formality, but out of memory. Behind them, once upon a time, someone had lived, someone born royal, someone who had laughed too loudly at dinner, asked too many questions in church, wandered the halls at night speaking to no one. And so, she was moved, quietly, softly, forgotten. They said madness ran in the family, not with certainty, but with caution, with the weight of centuries behind the word, with the kind of fear that's inherited, not learned. It was never said to the daughters directly. It was whispered when they cried too much, when they stayed in bed too long, when they flinched at sudden noise or failed to smile at strangers. Just like her aunt, someone would mutter. Or, you know, her mother was delicate. Delicate, a word that hid everything and explained nothing. It began small, a shadow beneath the eyes, a forgetfulness, a sudden silence during music lessons, and then perhaps a scream in the night, or a refusal to eat, or a trembling hand that couldn't hold a quill. The physicians were summoned, the church consulted, but rarely did anyone ask her what she was feeling, because her feelings were irrelevant. Her mind was not her own. It belonged to the crown. Some were sent away, to convents, to distant country estates, to rest. Their names remained on the family tree, but their stories ended quietly. Letters stopped arriving. Portraits were removed from display. And when guests asked what had become of her, the answer was always vague. She had married quietly. She had taken holy orders. She had died of illness. No one ever said she was hidden. Others remained, walking the same halls with bowed heads and careful steps. They learned to control the shiver in their voice, to blink away the tears before anyone noticed, to nod and smile and sit very still. Because once the word madness was spoken, it did not leave. It clung, it followed, it colored everything. And it was always the women. The sons could rage, could drink, could fall into violent fits. And still they were strong, passionate, troubled. The daughters, though, needed only to hesitate, to falter once, and they were suspected, watched, managed, tested, their minds not their own, their thoughts filtered through chaperones and confessors and physicians with long quills and longer judgments. There were stories, of course. The princess who painted nothing but blackbirds, the duchess who danced alone in the rose garden for hours, the queen who believed she could speak to the dead. None of them lasted long. Their endings were always the same: silence. And beneath it all, the question no one dared ask: was it the blood or was it the life? Because what mind could survive the weight of the crown, the scrutiny, the expectations, the fear of never being enough, or worse, being too much? What woman could carry all that and not, at some point, break? Tonight we remember not the madness, but the women lost beneath it. Not for their outbursts or their disappearances, but for the loneliness that preceded them. For the warning signs dismissed, for the fears mocked, for the minds that might have healed, had they ever been heard. Not every curse is born in blood. Some are born in silence. They taught her to stand tall. No one asked what it cost her spine. Before she could speak fluently, she was taught how to sit. Not like a child, like a lady. Back straight, ankles crossed, hands gently folded in her lap, not resting, but posed. Her spine learned early that comfort was not an option. Her feet learned not to stray too wide. Her shoulders forgot how to relax. And all of this was called grace. When she learned to walk, it was not with freedom, but with form. Books were placed atop her head, not for reading, but for balance. Missteps were corrected with sighs. Slouching earned silence, the disappointed kind. Her gowns were hemmed just long enough to trip her if she dared hurry. And so she slowed down, learned to glide, learned to disappear into posture. By the time she was a maiden, she was no longer asked how she felt, only how she appeared. Her skin was examined, her voice modulated, her hair controlled with oils and ribbons and brushes made from boar bristles. But it was her body that bore the brunt of royalty's invisible burden. Corsets, they called them. Boned, laced, and tightened until her ribs learned to yield. They spoke of elegance, of tradition, of beauty, but they never spoke of bruises, or the fainting spells, or the way it felt to breathe with only half your lungs. They never spoke of how her heart raced from lack of air, or how her meals stayed small, not from vanity, but necessity. There simply wasn't room. She was praised for her tiny waist, not for her mind, her skills, her memory, but for the space between her hands when she encircled her own body. That was what made her valuable, what made her suitable. Not strong, not clever, but small. The shoes were another kind of cage, shaped not for walking, but for standing still. They lifted her just enough to tilt her hips forward, to strain the arch of her foot, to demand balance where rest might have been. And when she danced, it was not for joy. It was choreography of survival. Each step memorized, each turn a performance. The smile always practiced, even when her ankles throbbed. She carried herself like porcelain, because that was what they wanted. Delicate, untouchable, breakable in the right way. She learned not to fall, because a fall was scandal. She learned not to limp, even when her body ached. Pain was supposed to be invisible, because if anyone saw it, they would ask questions. And questions for a royal daughter were dangerous. Over time, her body began to bend beneath the weight of it all. Not visibly, not yet. But her spine grew tired of holding every expectation. Her hips whispered of future complications. Her lungs pressed against corset bones until her breath grew thin. But she smiled, always smiled, because royalty was not allowed to sag, not allowed to rest. The crown had no room for discomfort. And when she aged, they wondered why she couldn't bear children, why her bones ached early, why her back stooped, why she grew frail. They forgot how tightly she had been bound, how many years her body had been treated as display, how long she had carried the weight of perfection. Tonight we remember not the posture, not the gowns, not the poise, but the pain, the aching bones behind the elegance, the bruises beneath the bodice, the quiet endurance of bodies shaped to please the eye, but never asked if they hurt. They told her she was born to wear a crown, but they never said it would cost her breath, her balance, her very bone. She lived briefly. Then she became a name someone else wore. The archives are thick with names. So many of them repeat. Margaret, Isabella, Anne, Catherine, Maria. You see one and then another and another still. Sometimes they're marked with a birth year and a dash, with nothing after it. Sometimes they have a title that never came into use. Sometimes they don't even have that. Just a name and silence. These were not legends, not queens, not rebels. They were daughters, royal daughters, the kind born between wars, between alliances, between more important children. They were not expected to rule. They were expected to marry, or to die young, or to simply not take up too much space. Some died before their first birthday. Illness, fever, bad air, too many candles in the nursery. Their names were whispered once at court, then never again. Others lived a little longer, long enough to be painted once, to be taught how to curtsy, to be promised in marriage though the contract was never fulfilled, and when they vanished, no one announced it. The court simply moved on, reassigned the name. There is something strange, almost cruel in how the same names were used again and again. A Maria born and gone by spring, another Maria born that autumn. The second child lived longer. People remembered her. When asked about the first, most said, "You must be mistaken. That's the same girl." It wasn't, but no one argued. Sometimes the name lived longer than the girl who first bore it. Not every daughter had a grave. Some were buried in royal vaults with no marker. Others were interred in convent grounds, far from court, their passing deemed too quiet to mention. In the family trees, they exist only as lines, sometimes crossed out, sometimes misspelled, sometimes missing altogether. The portraits on the palace walls never included them. They were not considered worthy of oil and canvas. No commemorative coins, no church windows with their likeness, no statues standing in gardens. Just faint echoes in ledger books, half legible in ink that has turned the color of dried blood. And yet they lived. They had mothers who sang to them, nurses who held them through fevers, tutors who praised their penmanship. They smiled once. They cried when scolded. They clung to the hems of skirts. They had favorite flowers, even if no one remembered which. They whispered secrets to sisters who outlived them. They mattered. But history remembers noise, victory, betrayal, coronations. Not the quiet exhale of a girl who never left the nursery. Not the fading footsteps of a princess who died before she was ever introduced at court. Not the space she left behind in her mother's arms. Tonight we remember them. The daughters who didn't become wives or queens or mothers. The ones who were not buried under stone, but under the weight of repetition. Forgotten not because they failed, but because they came first or last or at the wrong time. Not every royal has a legacy. Some only had a name, and even that was taken. It had silk curtains, golden trim, and a bed too big for her fears. They told her it would be her home now, that this was where she belonged. She was 11 when she arrived. The carriage had bumped over roads she didn't know the names of, past fields and forests that didn't belong to her father. The palace loomed like a story told too many times, ornate, perfect, wrong. Her new room was large. That's what they mentioned first. as if size meant comfort, as if space could replace familiarity. The bed was high, carved with symbols she couldn't read. The sheets were scented with something sharp and floral, not the lavender her nurse used back home. The windows looked out over nothing she recognized. Everything was beautiful, and everything was wrong. The maids were kind, but distant. They curtsied too deeply, called her princess in an accent she hadn't heard before. No one called her by the nickname her brothers used. No one braided her hair with the same rhythm. Her toys were gone, replaced by dolls with painted faces and cold porcelain fingers that never curled in comfort. A tutor arrived the next morning, speaking lessons in a new tongue. Her own language began to feel like something that didn't belong to her anymore. They said she would adjust. This was the price of alliance. A marriage signed before her 10th birthday, a promise made between kings and sealed with her name. She had seen the letter. She had held the ring that would one day mark her as queen. But she had not known it meant this kind of leaving, this kind of forgetting. She wrote home, at first every day, describing the shape of her windows, the color of the drapes, the way the tea tasted different here. She asked about the garden she used to hide in, about the puppy she wasn't allowed to bring, about her sister's cough. The letters came back slower, then less often, then not at all. No one explained why. The portraits in the hallway watched her pass. Women in high collars and stiff posture. Their eyes didn't follow her. Their names weren't familiar. Their rooms were once hers too, in a way. A line of girls who had come before, who had learned the same language, worn the same dresses, smiled the same small smile at dinner. She didn't know their stories, only that they had all at some point stood alone in the same room, wondering why they felt like ghosts before they had even lived. She was not mistreated. No one shouted. No one raised a hand. She was fed, clothed, adorned, but never embraced. Not truly. Her presence was ceremonial, an object in the right place, a symbol of treaty, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. And so she moved through the palace quietly, learned which doors creaked, which servants would speak, learned to bow at the right moments, learned to disappear when her presence became inconvenient. She lived in a room full of embroidered cushions, but there was never a pillow that remembered the shape of her head. Years would pass before the marriage itself, but the girl she had been had already been given away, traded, removed. She would not return home. She would not reclaim her name. She would grow into the mold carved for her, and when they spoke of her, they would say she was lucky, that she had married well, that she had rooms and titles and gold. But not once would they ask what she missed, or who she might have become had she been allowed to stay. Tonight we remember the girls sent away before they could decide if they wanted to go. The ones who slept in rooms prepared for them, but never theirs. The ones who learned early that the walls might glitter, but they did not echo with their laughter. The chests arrived before she did, and they were greeted with more ceremony. Before they met her, they counted her value, not in words, in ledgers, in wax-sealed documents signed by men in rooms she would never enter. Her name was written, but it was the numbers beside it that mattered. Gold, land, titles, troops, a treaty made flesh. Her worth was not in her laughter, or the books she loved, or the songs she hummed under her breath. It was in what she brought with her, what could be claimed, inherited, displayed. She was 14 when the negotiations began in earnest. The men spoke around her, never to her. Her father stroked his beard, her mother kept her silence, and the ambassador asked if she had all her teeth. She smiled on command, the smile that was rehearsed, the one she had practiced in the mirror, the one they said made her look agreeable. She did not smile because she was happy. She smiled because it was expected. That smile, too, became part of the deal. When the agreement was made, the coffers were opened, jewels selected, linens stitched with both royal crests, chests filled with silver and silks, incense and spices, furs and fine things. everything that could prove her worth beyond her skin. Her dowry grew heavier with each passing week, while she grew quieter. And then one morning the carts left. She followed later. But the procession with her dowry was grander. Trumpets sounded as it passed city gates. People bowed. The receiving court unlatched the chest with reverence. They weighed the gold, fingered the lace, cataloged each piece like treasure newly discovered. She was still en route, seasick and silent in a ship cabin that smelled of varnish and salt. When she arrived, they measured her too, not openly, but with glances. The king's steward noted her posture. The queen's ladies assessed her skin. The prince, her future husband, nodded once, then turned away. She was not ugly. She was not stunning. She was what they had expected, and that was enough. Her beauty, if any, was incidental. The gold had already arrived. She slept that night in a room carved with foreign crests, dressed in linens she did not choose. Outside her window, guards paced in uniforms unfamiliar to her. Inside, the air smelled of incense instead of the lavender of home. Her new maids unbraided her hair without asking. They did not speak her tongue. In the days that followed, she learned her place. Learned when to appear, when to be silent, when to smile. The dowry was mentioned often, in toasts, in court gossip, in documents that reaffirmed treaties. No one mentioned her name unless attached to what she had brought. When the marriage was celebrated, the chests were on display, arranged like trophies. The jewels shone brighter than the candlelight in her eyes. Guests gasped over the tapestries, the pearls, the coins stamped with her father's face. But no one asked if she slept well, or if she missed her brother, or if she was afraid. Over time, she became what they expected: regal, composed, quiet. Her husband came to her chamber as duty required and spoke little more. She bore what was asked. She dined when summoned. She smiled when addressed. Her value had already been paid. Her presence was merely upkeep. No one ever said she was enough without the gold. Tonight we remember the daughters who were sold not as slaves, but as symbols. Not for what they were, but for what they brought. The girls whose dowries were discussed with more passion than their hearts. The ones who were never asked, only packaged. The ones who smiled on command, because that too was part of the price. The lace had yellowed. The silence had not. The dress had been folded for years, tucked into cedar-lined chests, protected from moss and memory. It had once shimmered in candlelight, been touched by dozens of hands, admired, praised, and finally removed in the stillness of a bridal chamber where no one asked if she had wept. Her mother had worn it, once, then never spoke of it again. Now it was laid out again, stretched across the bed like a question without a kind answer. The seams let out to fit a younger body with smaller hopes. The embroidery restitched by tired fingers. Pearls restrung, not because they had fallen, but because the old ones had dulled, much like the gaze of the woman who once wore them. The daughter stood before the mirror, still. Maids circled her, tucking, fastening, smoothing. They said she looked beautiful, that it was tradition, that it was an honor to wear what queens had worn before her. No one said what else came with the dress: the weight in the bodice, the stiffness in the sleeves, the quiet dread in the hem. Her mother watched from the chair beside the fire, hands folded, back straight, eyes not quite meeting the girl's reflection. She had chosen not to cry, chosen not to speak, but her silence spoke louder than tears. She remembered how the dress had fit her, how it had felt to walk into a hall filled with strangers, to smile until her face ached, to kneel at an altar where duty was louder than love. She remembered her wedding night, not for its passion, but for the ache of knowing she could not say no. She had hoped, quietly, foolishly, that her daughter might escape that path, that times would change, that some softer future might open, just enough for the girl to choose. But no, the match had been made, the letter signed, the procession arranged. And so the dress came out of the chest, along with every fear she had sewn into its seams. The daughter did not ask for a different gown. She knew better. She smiled when told she looked like her mother. She said thank you when the old women cooed about legacy. But when she was alone, she touched the collar, ran her fingers over the threadbare edge where the fabric had once torn. She found it comforting in a way, that even this perfect garment had a flaw, that even her mother had not been untouched. The wedding was grand. The halls were full, the air thick with incense and rosewater. Her footsteps echoed on stone, trailing lace and longing. Her husband-to-be waited at the end of the aisle, polished, unreadable. Their hands touched once, briefly. Cold skin against cold skin. The vows were said, the rings exchanged. Applause rose. Somewhere in the crowd, her mother looked down. That night, the dress was unfastened by different hands, laid aside on different sheets, and the girl lay still, the way she imagined her mother once had. Not because she was afraid of what was to come, but because she already knew. Some knowledge, after all, is inherited without words. In the morning, the dress was folded again, pressed, perfumed, hidden, not discarded, never that. It would be kept, always, for tradition, for legacy, for the next daughter. Tonight we remember not just the dress, but the women who wore it twice. First on their own wedding night, and again in memory as they watched their daughters walk toward the same fate. The fabric faded. The fear did not. She laughed on cue, not because she felt joy, but because someone had paused, waiting for it. It began in the nursery, the gentle correction of tone. Not too loud, darling. Not with your mouth so open. Try to sound more delicate. At first, she didn't understand. Laughter had come easily to her as a child, giggling in the garden when the wind caught her bonnet, chuckling when the puppy chased its tail, howling with delight when her sister made silly faces behind the governess's back. But slowly, quietly, those moments grew fewer. Each one followed by a comment, a look, a reminder. By the time she turned 9, laughter had become something she thought about, a performance, like everything else. The etiquette mistress showed her how to smile with just the right curl of lip, how to laugh with her hand covering her mouth, not because she was embarrassed, but because it was unseemly to show her teeth. She learned not to throw her head back, even when something was truly funny. That was common, unladylike, uncontrolled. So she practiced. In front of the mirror, under the gaze of tutors and attendants, she refined it. A soft exhale like a sigh made of sugar, a delicate trill, light and brief, easily mistaken for approval rather than amusement. She memorized where laughter should fall in conversation. After a noble's jest, even if it wasn't clever. After a suitor's boast, even if it made her stomach twist. Never too loud, never too soon, never too late, and never, never for herself. At court, she became known for her composure. So well-mannered, such grace. She carries herself like a queen already. But no one mentioned that her smile never reached her eyes, that her laugh never startled a bird from the window, that it never erupted, uncontrolled from her chest. It came in measured drops, like perfume, like poison. She noticed over time how others laughed. The kitchen maids when they thought no one was listening. Their joy was full-bodied, careless, real. Their shoulders shook, their heads tilted. Their voices rang out like bells. She envied them, not for their status, but for the permission they had to be honest in their happiness. She did not have that permission. In private, she would sometimes close the doors, sit at the edge of her bed, and try to remember how she used to sound when she laughed. Not the breathy chuckle she gave at banquets, not the shallow giggle rehearsed for diplomacy, but the sound she had once made when her father had lifted her high into the air, before he had begun calling her my little alliance. But it was hard to find, like a song half forgotten. The more she reached for it, the further it slipped away. Her husband said she was charming, that he appreciated her restraint, that some women were too loud, too eager, too emotional. She nodded, she smiled, she laughed softly, and then looked away. Years later, when she had daughters of her own, she heard them laugh, freely, foolishly, brightly. For a moment, her heart lifted, but then she heard the nursemaid's correction. "Not so loud, Your Highness, not so wild," and something in her quieted again. She didn't stop the correction. She just stood very still and listened as another girl's laughter began to dim. Tonight we remember the ones who learned to laugh on cue, not out of joy, but expectation. The ones who silenced their own delight so that others could feel comfortable. The ones whose smiles were rehearsed, whose happiness was edited, whose light was softened until it no longer warmed even themselves. She memorized the sound of power in other people's voices. Hers was only ever an echo. Long before she understood politics, she understood silence. It came dressed in courtesy, wrapped in obedience, praised as virtue. She was told that a princess must be observant, that wisdom meant listening, that a girl's charm lay in her stillness, in the way she folded her hands and tilted her head and kept her thoughts tucked neatly behind her eyes. She was praised for being quiet, so polite, so poised. She never interrupts. They said this as though it were rare, as though it took effort not to speak, but it did, because she had so much to say. She had questions about the treaties being signed with her name, about the expressions that flickered across her mother's face when the court was not watching, about why the servants avoided her gaze, about why no one ever said the word love, but she kept those questions inside, not because she had no voice, but because she had learned what happened when she used it. The first time she interrupted, she was 7. Her father was discussing land disputes with visiting nobles. She had heard the name of a town she recognized from her maps. Eager, she offered a comment. Her father's smile did not fade, but his fingers tightened around his goblet. Later, he explained that her thoughts were clever, yes, but better shared in private. "A young lady must know when to speak and when to wait," he said. She remembered the warmth draining from her cheeks, and after that, she waited. She listened to everything, the rhythm of negotiations, the tone shift in council chambers, the unspoken meanings in court gossip. She learned to read glances, to translate sighs, to anticipate moods before they became commands. And still, she was told she was not ready, that she lacked experience, that she must observe longer, that her silence was her strength. At diplomatic dinners, she sat beside men who spoke over her plate about her future as though she were an object between them. She smiled. She nodded. She was congratulated for her attentiveness. But not once was she asked for an opinion. Not once was she invited to join the game, only to sit on the sidelines and clap when others scored. She wrote thoughts in her diary instead, pages and pages of analysis, insight, ideas, none of which would ever reach a throne or a table or even a conversation. She read philosophy, languages, law. Her tutors were impressed, but their praise ended with a phrase she came to resent. "A brilliant mind for a lady." Sometimes late at night, she whispered to the mirror, practicing speeches she would never give, questions she would never pose, arguments she had already won in her head. Her reflection listened. It was the only face that did. And when she became a wife, her voice grew even softer. Her husband preferred it that way. When she offered suggestions, he thanked her kindly, then did as he pleased. When she disagreed, he smiled like a man humoring a child. She became fluent in silence again. It wrapped around her like a cloak. Safe, expected, heavy. Years later, people would describe her as wise, as thoughtful. They would say she was a calming presence, that she knew when to hold her tongue, but they would never know what she had wanted to say, because she was never asked, and she had been taught too well to offer it freely. Tonight we remember the women whose brilliance lived quietly behind their eyes, who heard everything, saw everything, but were never given the room to speak. The daughters who memorized power without ever tasting it, who were taught that to be good was to be quiet, that their silence was their gift and their curse. They praised her presence, but not her pain. She entered the room and heads turned, as they always did. Her gown shimmered in the low candlelight, every pleat placed with precision, every jewel selected to complement the color of her eyes, which no one really looked into. They admired her, commented on her grace, her bearing, the way she moved like a painting, like a symbol, like something almost real. She was always seen, but never noticed. From the moment she could stand still for longer than a minute, she had been rehearsed, dressed, arranged. Her hair braided in patterns older than the language she spoke. Her steps counted in rhythm with the court musicians. Her gestures measured by the etiquette master who insisted on quiet elegance. Even her stillness was choreographed. She had no room to shift without being observed. No expression that went unstudied. If she laughed too freely, they said she was giddy. If she stood too silent, they wondered if she was sullen. Her posture, her tone, her choice of brooch, all were interpreted like scripture. But no one asked how she was, only how she looked. When she walked through the garden, nobles bowed. When she passed in the corridor, servants stepped aside. When she entered the great hall, trumpets sounded. But none of those people had ever heard her speak without a script. None knew what made her anxious, or what made her heart flutter, beyond arranged matches and family honor. At night in her chambers, the silence was loudest. The mirrors reflected a girl the world would describe as fortunate, radiant, regal. But she didn't recognize the reflection. It was all so carefully composed. She could not remember the last time she had laughed without weighing how it might sound to others. She could not remember the last time she had cried without turning her face to the wall. They said she had everything: jewels, dresses, a title, a future bound to greatness. But she felt like a window dressed in velvet, admired, framed, never opened. She kept a small box beneath her bed, hidden behind layers of brocade. Inside were scraps of her childhood, a ribbon from her nursemaid, a pressed flower from the garden she wasn't supposed to pick from, a drawing she once made of a horse with too many legs. No one had ever seen that drawing. It was the only thing in her world not judged. Sometimes at formal events, she would feel eyes on her and wonder what they thought they saw. Beauty, perhaps. Discipline. Bloodline. None would guess she hadn't eaten that morning, that her slippers pinched, that her smile hid 1,000 unspoken questions. They would speak of her elegance, her composure, her presence, but never her person. She lived like a statue in a hall of mirrors, endlessly viewed, never touched, surrounded by admiration and starving for recognition. For someone who would look past the silk and jewels and see the girl beneath it all, the one who once chased butterflies, who once wanted to write stories, who once thought being seen meant being known. Tonight we remember the daughters who were always in the spotlight, but never in someone's heart. The ones whose lives were lived on display, yet who remained invisible where it mattered most. The ones who were looked at, but never truly seen. She bled for the crown before she ever wore it. It began with prayers whispered outside her chamber. Prayers not for her health, but for the sex of the child. The midwives murmured them as they passed holy relics over her belly. The advisors lit candles, not for a safe delivery, but for a boy. Only a boy. She heard none of this directly, of course. It would have been improper to say such things aloud, but she saw it in their eyes. The way the physician hesitated before speaking. The way her husband touched her stomach with a quiet intensity, like a gambler studying his final card. The way the Queen Mother tightened her lips in silent judgment. No one asked how she felt, only how she fared. And even that was ritual. The pregnancy itself was a pageant, carefully managed, carefully watched. Her appetite, her posture, the color of her cheeks, everything was noted. She was treated like a sacred vessel, revered, yes, but never comforted, touched but not held, adorned but not embraced. She dreamed often of small hands, of voices calling her mother. But in the dreams, the child was always faceless, as if even her own subconscious dared not assume what the court would not accept. When labor came, it was long, agonizing, and alone. There were women around her, of course, midwives, healers, even a priest standing quietly at the door. But no one she loved, no one who whispered her name the way it had once been said, before titles, before alliances. She cried out, not from pain, but from the weight of expectation, the pressure of centuries pressing down on her spine. Every scream was a prayer, every breath a bargain. When the child arrived, they didn't tell her right away. They checked, weighed, swaddled, whispered. She could hear them, but not the words. Then came the announcement. A son! The room exhaled. Applause outside. A cheer from the corridor. A life had begun, but hers had dimmed. She smiled because it was expected. She was weak for days after. They called it recovery, but she knew better. It was absence. Something in her had been taken. Not just the child, but something quieter, something unspoken, a piece of light that would not return. Her husband visited once. He kissed her forehead, thanked her, praised her. He looked down at the baby, already called His Highness, and smiled wider than he had in months. Then he left, summoned by duties more urgent than gratitude. She was alone again, this time with a crowned prince in the cradle and a silence she hadn't earned but couldn't escape. And had the child been a girl, she didn't let herself wonder, not aloud. But she had heard the stories of queens cast aside, of duchesses sent to convents, of names rewritten and history softened. Some were lucky, some were not. She had done her duty, for now, but she also knew the next child must be a boy too, or this celebration would become memory. And memory in royal courts fades faster than favor. Tonight we remember the women whose value rose and fell with the shape of the child they carried. The ones who gave life while risking their own. Who were praised for what they produced and forgotten for who they were. The ones whose bodies bore kingdoms and whose names, if remembered at all, were footnotes beneath their sons. She was born to be queen, until she wasn't. From her earliest days, they told her she was different, special, not just a princess, but a future monarch. The lessons were harder, the expectations sharper. She learned languages her cousins were never taught, studied law while other girls practiced embroidery. Her tutors praised her insight, her clarity, her resolve. A mind fit for a throne, one of them whispered once, as if the compliment itself might cause scandal. She believed them, not out of vanity but out of purpose. She had been handed a map of the future, and she followed it faithfully. She woke at dawn for lessons, memorized treaties, learned to speak not only with eloquence, but with consequence. She watched her father in council, not with awe, but with calculation. She wasn't playing court, she was preparing for it. They called her the Little Queen. It was said with pride and a touch of irony, because deep down everyone knew it could only last until fate decided otherwise. And fate came in the form of a cry, a son born to her mother in late autumn, pale and small and weeping, but a boy nonetheless. That night the bells rang louder than they had for her birth, the streets filled with celebration. An heir, they shouted, a king at last. She heard them from her chamber, where no one had lit a single candle. The next morning her schedule changed, slightly. Then again, a week later. Her history lessons shortened. Her presence in court no longer required. The statecraft texts replaced with etiquette manuals. Her crown-shaped dreams began to wilt, slowly, quietly, like flowers in a vase no one bothers to water. No one explained, not directly. They praised her still, but with softer words. A true lady, an asset in any court. So graceful, but never again. So ready, never again. So destined. She asked her father once, carefully, what her future would be now. He smiled and said she would make a fine bride one day, that kings across the continent would be lucky to have her. And just like that, she was reduced, not in value, but in use. No longer the ruler, now the reward. She did not rebel. That was not her way. But inside, something folded in on itself. The map she had walked so faithfully no longer led anywhere. Her hands, trained to hold power, now held teacups and embroidery hoops. She listened to her brother's lessons through the walls, lessons she had already mastered, and no one asked her to help. She was too useful to discard, too dangerous to empower. So she smiled at the guests, played her harpsichord, wore gowns that glittered just enough. And when diplomats came, they paraded her like a fine portrait, beautiful, composed, and silent. But at night, she still dreamed in strategy. Her mind, honed for leadership, refused to dull. She imagined answers to questions never asked of her, composed speeches no one would hear, solved problems that would never be hers to fix. The crown, invisible now, still rested on her shoulders. She had worn it in her mind for so long that she could feel its shape, even in absence. And though it had never touched her brow, its weight pressed down on her spirit, a constant, aching reminder of what had been promised, then revoked. Tonight we remember the daughters trained to rule, and then told to wait, the ones who walked the halls of power without ever opening its doors, the girls who were polished, prepared, and praised until they were not needed. The crown they never wore still left its mark. Once she was his shadow, then she became his silence. As a child, she followed him everywhere. Through the echoing halls, down the garden paths, to the edge of council chambers, where the doors were always shut to her, but never to him. She had small legs, but they moved quickly when he walked, and he would laugh and slow down, offering her a finger to hold. "My little hawk," he called her, sharp-eyed, fierce. She glowed under the weight of that praise. He lifted her onto his lap during audiences, whispered stories to her while ministers droned on, tucked loose strands of hair behind her ears with surprising gentleness. And when she fell asleep by the fire in his study, he carried her to her room himself. Despite the servants waiting just outside, she believed, with the certainty only children possess, that he loved her more than anything. And perhaps he did once. But girls do not stay little. They grow. Their laughter shifts in tone. Their dresses lengthen. Their presence begins to draw eyes. Eyes that calculate alliances and dowries and legacies. Somewhere in that slow unfolding of years, she changed, and so did he. First sign was subtle. He stopped lifting her into his arms. She was too tall now, too proper. Then came the change in tone, warmer than the weather, colder than memory. He still smiled at her, but not with the same ease. He kissed her forehead, but only in public. His words turned from affection to instruction. Walk straighter. Speak less at table. You must begin to understand your role. And she did. Oh, how she did. She studied what pleased him and performed it, dressed as he preferred, held her tongue at court, practiced piano until her fingers ached because he once said music made a lady elegant. She became the daughter she thought he wanted, but the warmth never returned. When she tried to remind him of old games, he chuckled politely and changed the subject. When she asked about riding with him, as they once had each spring, he said he was too busy. When she lingered by his study doors, hoping he'd notice, he asked the steward to escort her elsewhere. She watched as he laughed more freely with ministers than with her, spoke more tenderly to his hounds than to the girl who had once clung to his leg, and declared she would never marry because she would always belong to him. She did not cry, not then, but something inside her folded, carefully, quietly, like the old drawings she once gave him, now tucked beneath her mattress, their corners yellowing. The final shift came with a letter, a proposed match. She was 16. The ink was still fresh when he handed it to her. "A good offer," he said, eyes already elsewhere. "You will make us proud." There was no conversation, no question, no trace of the man who once called her his hawk and promised never to send her anywhere she didn't want to go. Only a monarch speaking to a political asset. She curtsied, nodded, and walked away before her voice could betray her. That night, she stood in the garden where they once raced in spring. The wind tugged at her sleeves like small hands. She tilted her head to the stars and tried to remember the last time he had said her name without duty attached. She couldn't. Tonight we remember the daughters who were loved until they became inconvenient. The girls who were cherished as children but forgotten as women. Who learned that affection could be conditional and that growing up meant growing distant. They were never told what they did wrong, only that they were no longer enough. They counted her lashes like coins. She counted the days like a prisoner. She was told from the beginning that she was beautiful, long before she knew what that meant, before she understood the way people looked at her and saw not a child, but a prospect. Her governess whispered it like a blessing. Her maids echoed it with pride. Courtiers said it in passing like a prophecy no one dared to question. Such eyes, such hair, she will make a fine match. It was meant to comfort her, but it never did. Her reflection became a ledger. She studied it as if it might change overnight. The tilt of her nose, the color of her skin, the curve of her mouth. She cataloged them like inventory. Each day, someone reminded her this would matter, more than her thoughts, more than her voice, more than her preferences. This was what the world wanted, what the men would want, and what the crown would use. At dinners, visiting lords glanced longer than they should. Ministers made comments just shy of impropriety. Even women, queens, duchesses, dowagers, observed her with cool assessment. Not envy, not warmth, but calculation. She saw the look often enough to name it appraisal. She smiled when expected, wore the dresses chosen for her, sat where the light caught her cheek just right. But inside she wished to vanish. Not forever, just long enough to breathe. She had no interest in mirrors. They were not for her anymore. They belonged to the kingdom. Her beauty was not hers to enjoy. It was to be spent. A dowry wrapped in skin and silk. A token sent across borders. A painting made of flesh. She heard the whispers in the halls. With looks like that, she won't stay unwed long. The ambassadors are already circling. It's only a matter of time. Time, that was the word that hurt most. Because with each passing season, the air changed around her. Conversations shifted from books to bridal fabrics, from tutors to titles, from what she wanted to where she would be sent. They said she was lucky. She nodded, but she didn't feel lucky. She felt like a vase on a mantle, polished, admired, and placed exactly where others thought she belonged. No one ever asked if she liked her face, if she saw it as power or prison, if she wished just once to be overlooked, to be forgettable, to be safe. Because beauty was not a shield, it was a spotlight, and under its glow she could not move freely, could not fail, could not grow into anything unexpected. One evening after yet another suitor's visit, she stood alone in her chamber and stared at her reflection in the window. Not the mirror. The glass blurred slightly in the night's damp breath, and she liked the way it softened her features, made her face look less like hers and more like someone else's. Someone unmarked by expectation, unnamed by alliances. She did not weep. She had long stopped doing that. But she wished silently that her worth had come from something she could choose, something she could shape, something not so easily sold. Tonight we remember the women whose beauty became their cage. The daughters praised not for who they were, but for how well they could be paraded. Who learned to wield a power they never asked for, one that never truly belonged to them. Their beauty was a gift to others, but never to themselves. They bowed to her, but they bargained without her. When the first suitor came, she was told to wear pale blue. "It flatters your skin," her governess said, "and blue suggests calmness, modesty, fertility. She did not ask why any of that mattered, though she already knew. Her hands were folded, her chin tilted, her smile fixed. She had rehearsed the posture, the polite laughter, the poised silence. She was ready in the only way she was allowed to be. He arrived with flowers and flattery. A prince from the north, with sharp eyes and a practiced charm. He complimented her grace, admired the garden, told her he had heard she played the lute. She thanked him, answered briefly, then stepped back, as instructed, so the men could talk. Because the real conversation never included her, she watched them from her corner. Her father and the suitor, surrounded by advisors and maps and legacy. Her name was spoken more times than she could count, but never with a question mark. Only as a sentence, as a certainty. She will be pleased. She is well trained. She understands duty. No one asked what she wanted. The next suitor brought letters, seals, and a jeweled ring. He was older, but established. Her father liked that. The two men dined alone while she played music in the adjoining room. She played softly as instructed, so her presence would be felt but not heard, so they could forget she was there, even as they discussed the terms of her life. She once overheard a phrase that stayed with her. She will bring dignity to the house. Like she was linen, like she was a crest etched into silverware. She smiled through it all, suitor after suitor, each more polished than the last, each more interested in lineage than laughter. They greeted her with warmth, but only as performance. She was a doorway. They spoke through her, around her, over her, never to her. Sometimes one would ask her a question directly. Do you ride? Do you paint? Do you enjoy the hunt? The questions were safe, meant only to confirm compatibility, not curiosity. She gave answers that pleased. Nothing too bold, nothing too shy. And then inevitably their attention returned to her father, where the real power lived. In private, she dreamed of a different meeting, one in which someone looked her in the eye and waited for her to speak first. One where she was not being measured, but heard. One where her life was not a pre-negotiated script, but a shared page waiting to be written. That meeting never came. And so she learned. Her role was not to choose, but to be chosen. Her charm was a tool, her silence a virtue, her future a transaction. Tonight we remember the women whose lives were decided in rooms where they stood only for display. The daughters whose smiles masked absence, whose presence was performative, whose fates were written in ink they never touched. They were praised for their elegance, but never consulted on their direction. They were the center of attention, and yet invisible in every decision. The kingdom celebrated, but no one stayed to see her close the door behind them. The wedding was everything they said it would be. Trumpets that made the sky tremble, crowds that lined the streets like waves of color, gilded carriages pulled by horses trained to step in perfect rhythm, every window framed with banners, every breath choreographed to honor the union. She smiled through it all, waved, curtsied, nodded at ambassadors whose names she would never remember. The dress was heavy, stitched with pearls and thread, spun finer than silk. It shimmered in the light of 1,000 candles, and it itched beneath her ribs. They called her radiant. They called him noble. They called it a triumph. But when the last toast had been raised, and the musicians had lowered their bows, and the guests had retired to their distant quarters with bellies full and spirits warm, she stood alone in the doorway of her new life. The corridor was long, the air colder than she expected. He waited in the chamber, her husband, her partner in name. His voice was soft, courteous, his hands not unkind. But they were strangers, bound not by love, but by ink, by signatures, by treaties, by the invisible web of alliances that wrapped around their bodies more tightly than any bridal veil. He offered her wine. She declined. He didn't insist. They sat, spoke, of nothing, of weather, of gardens, of horses, not of hopes, not of fears, not of longing. Later they lay side by side, the silence between them louder than the cheers that had followed them all day. She stared at the ceiling carved with symbols she didn't recognize. She memorized the pattern of shadows on the tapestry. She kept her breathing even, controlled, as she had been taught. When morning came, the sun found her awake, still in place, still composed. A queen now, or a duchess, or a consort, depending on which border you crossed. Her title had changed, her surroundings had changed, but she felt no different, only hollow in new places. The palace staff moved around her like she was sacred and breakable. The rooms were beautiful, the food exquisite, the gowns tailored to perfection. But no one called her by her childhood nickname. No one touched her shoulder with familiarity. No one asked, "Are you all right?" Because she was married now. She had been chosen. She had fulfilled her duty. The spectacle was over, and the quiet had begun. Some nights she would return to the marriage bed and find it untouched. He had fallen asleep in his study. Other nights he was there but distant, speaking only of matters of state. They shared meals, shared space, but rarely shared presence. She smiled in public. She dined in sequence. She wrote letters home filled with sunshine and reassurances. But in her heart she knew the wedding had been for them. The marriage was hers alone to endure. Tonight we remember the women whose weddings lit cities, but whose marriages dimmed their spirits. The daughters paraded as prizes, who crossed thresholds with applause in their ears and silence in their hearts, who were given away like treasures and left to figure out how to live inside the vault. He wore her ring, but the dynasty wore her life. At first she tried to understand him, the man she now called husband. He was courteous, punctual, never cruel, but also never warm, never curious. He kissed her hand at formal dinners, spoke her name with polished cadence, and referred to her as "my lady" more than anything else. They were married, yes, but they were not intimate. Not in the way stories promised, nor in the way childhood dreams had dared to imagine. He belonged entirely to something larger, a house, a name, a lineage that stretched back farther than she could trace. His every action filtered through the weight of it. His time was not his own, his choices not freely made. Even his glances were calculated, measured for what they projected, not what they revealed. She had married a man, but what she lived with, what shared her days and nights, was a dynasty. The palace walls carried their history like echoes. Portraits of stern ancestors lined the corridors, their painted eyes forever watching. The servants bowed to her, yes, but only because she now carried the crest, the motto, the expectation. Her body had become a vessel for legacy, her silence an extension of diplomacy. Her womb, the future's insurance. They watched what she wore, what she said, when she appeared, how she smiled. If she seemed too shy, they worried she lacked presence. If she laughed too much, they murmured about dignity. She was not a woman. She was a reflection of the dynasty, of the bloodline, of the marriage contract that was in truth never truly about her. He was kind sometimes, but distracted. His time belonged to the council, to treaties, to hunting parties and foreign emissaries. She saw him most at feasts, or when a portrait required them to stand together for hours in stillness. Their hands touched, but only because the artist needed symmetry. She spoke once, gently after supper, about her longing to travel, to see the sea again, to visit a chapel she had once loved. He nodded. "Perhaps someday," he said, "if the family schedule allows." And she realized slowly that her marriage was not a relationship, it was a role. She was a duchess or a queen, or a lady of a great estate. It did not matter the title. What mattered was that she embodied it correctly, that she smiled at christenings, that she stood at funerals, that she hosted when required and stayed silent when not. Even her letters home were read before being sealed. Her private moments existed only between pages of books she kept hidden behind religious texts. Her thoughts, the real ones, she buried in silence. There were nights when she lay awake and listened to the rhythm of the castle, footsteps fading in distant halls, wind humming through the arrow slits, the steady breath of duty pressing down on her ribs. She was not unloved, but she was not loved either. She was preserved, like stained glass, admired from afar, never touched, expected to last forever without breaking. Tonight we remember the women who married not into families, but into legacies, who wore gowns tailored to match banners and bore children to please portraits on the wall, who shared beds with men whose hearts were already pledged, not to another woman, but to an empire that never once asked if they were happy. He thanked her for the sun, but never looked her in the eyes again. It was said to be a triumph, a boy, healthy, loud, swaddled in silk, the color of empire. The bells rang at dawn. Courtiers wept with relief. Toasts were raised before she had even slept. And he, her husband, smiled in a way she had not seen since the day they met. They placed the child in his arms first. She watched from the bed, too weak to sit, the sheets beneath her still stained with the cost of success. He called the boy his pride, the future, the continuation of blood. And then he kissed her forehead, like one might thank a servant for a job well done. That was the last time he touched her with meaning. From that day forward, she ceased to be a partner. She became a shrine, a relic of achievement, tended to, maintained, but no longer needed. He dined without her, traveled often, slept in his study or in rooms where the fires burned brighter than in hers. She was not scorned, not mistreated, just set aside. Like a book closed mid-sentence. The child was raised by tutors, wet nurses, and protocol. She held him, yes, rocked him in the early hours, whispered lullabies she barely remembered from her own girlhood. But as he grew, he was taught to stand beside his father, not sit with his mother. Her voice became a background hum, her presence a ceremonial note. Once she asked if they could dine as a family, just once, without ministers or timetables. He blinked, smiled absently, and said, "You've done your part. Rest now," and then returned to his papers. She did not speak of it again. Her rooms became her world, filled with quiet things, embroidery, books, the sound of water in the garden just beyond her balcony. She walked the same path each morning, sat in the same chair each evening. The courtiers called her serene, graceful, a model of maternal virtue. They did not know she had forgotten the sound of laughter, her own especially. At court events, she stood behind him, beside him, always slightly out of frame. They called her the mother of the air, never his wife, never her name. And so she faded, not in years, but in presence. She had given him what he needed, a son, a future, a reason to stop needing her. Tonight, we remember the women who fulfilled their duty and then vanished behind it. The ones who bore the legacy and were left behind by it, who were honored but never held, who became stories told in footnotes, their only monument the child who carried another man's name. Oil remembered her better than any living soul did. The painter arrived with a trunk full of brushes, a canvas taller than she was, in the eyes of someone who had seen too many women trying to look like something they weren't. He greeted her with reverence, called her grace incarnate, asked her where she preferred to be seated, but his words, like the oils he carried, were only meant to preserve an illusion. She was told to wear the blue gown, the one with the embroidered lilies, stitched by hand in a convent far from court, a gift for this very occasion. They placed jewels at her throat, smoothed her hair, adjusted the way her fingers curled, the way her shoulders rested. Even her posture was not entirely hers. They said it would be quick. It was not. Each morning for a week, she sat still in a golden chair while the artist captured her likeness. Not as she was, tired, distant, fading, but as she ought to appear. Radiant, regal, composed. He asked her to smile, not too wide, not too soft, just enough to be remembered as kind, not giddy, noble, not cold. She did. He painted. The face on the canvas was familiar, almost. It held her cheekbones, her lips, her hair, but not her thoughts, not the weight behind her gaze, not the absence in her chest. It was a version of her that never spoke too much, never asked for anything, never remembered what it had once hoped for. The painting was unveiled at a banquet. Applause followed. Ministers praised its accuracy. Distant cousins remarked on her youth, her poise. Even her husband nodded approvingly, though he had not looked her in the eye since the last harvest. It was hung in the great hall, beside ancestors she had never known. There she remained, frozen in pigment, perfectly lit, eternally silent. Years passed. New portraits joined hers. New brides, new queens, new women painted into place. But hers remained the one guests stopped at. She was said to be very wise, they'd murmur. Very quiet, a model of virtue. No one mentioned the nights she stood alone in her garden until the stars blurred, or the way she folded letters she never sent, or the books she hid between the folds of her prayer robes. Those things did not make it into the frame. A century later, a child walking the corridor pointed to her portrait and asked, "Was she happy?" The governess beside him paused, then said, "She smiled, didn't she?" And they moved on. Tonight we remember the women who lived full lives in quiet corners and were remembered only in stillness, who were painted with care but never truly seen, who learned that a portrait could capture beauty but never truth. That silence, once chosen or enforced, is the part no artist dares to color in. They footnoted her life, but it held the weight of empires. In the great halls of history, their names are barely whispers, not etched in bronze, not carved into triumphal arches, perhaps mentioned once, in passing, as daughter of, wife to, or mother of the air. And then the chronicle moves on, chasing battles, kings, treaties, bloodlines, the men who made noise, the wars that rattled crowns. But she was there, at the edge of the throne room where silence lived, behind the veil where strategies whispered in kitchens and nursery wings, in the morning light, waiting for letters, in the twilight, lighting candles others would later blow out. Her hands didn't hold swords or seals. They held things more fragile, futures, rumors, expectations, children. They said she did not change the world, that she simply endured it. But endurance is a kind of revolution too, because in every alliance that held, in every prince who learned compassion, in every kingdom that did not fall to ruin, she was there, teaching, listening, writing letters no one would archive, holding peace where anger wanted to speak. She calmed storms no bard thought worthy to sing about. She didn't need monuments. Her memory lives in the softened hearts of sons who ruled better because they knew her. In the quiet reforms that began at her supper table. In the generations who carried her mannerisms, her lullabies, her way of holding a cup or choosing mercy over pride. And even when her name faded, even when her portrait yellowed, her jewels passed down to women who never knew her voice, still she endured. Not as legend, but as foundation. The books may forget her, the scribes may write over her, the cathedrals may not echo her footsteps, but the empire she helped carry on her shoulders still stands. And somewhere in its stones, her presence hums, soft as a mother's breath, steady as the earth beneath a coronation. Tonight and always, we remember the women who lived in history's margins, who were never crowned for their sacrifices, never praised for their restraint, but who held the world together in quiet ways. They were never small, only unseen. And now we see them,